The stagecoach hit the rut hard enough to snap the rear axle clean, and that was how Abigail Carter found herself lying face down in the red dust of nowhere, her cheek pressed against ground that smelled of iron and heat, her ears still ringing from the impact and from the sound of Victor's voice. That particular cold, cutting tone he used when he wanted her to feel small, which was most of the time. She lay still for a moment before she pushed herself up. That was the thing about Abigail that people never bothered to notice. She always pushed herself up. She'd been doing it her whole life, from the schoolyard in Cincinnati where the girls pinched their noses and called her names she'd long since memorized, to the parlors of polite society where women smiled at her face and whispered at her back, to the years she'd spent believing Victor Hale when he said she was lucky to have him. She got to her knees, then her feet. The prairie stretched out in every direction, flat and merciless beneath a summer sky the color of hammered copper. Heat came up off the ground in visible waves. The stagecoach sat crookedly in the dirt 30 yards behind her, the driver already crouching to inspect the broken axle with the particular expression of a man calculating how much this was going to cost him. The two other passengers, a traveling merchant and his nervous wife, stood off to the side, brushing dust from their clothes and murmuring to each other. Victor was standing beside the coach. He had not gone to see if Abigail was hurt. He was examining his jacket cuff instead, turning it back and forth as though searching for damage. "You're bleeding," said the merchant's wife, her voice careful in the way voices get around things that make people uncomfortable. Abigail touched her cheek. Her fingers came away red. "I know," she said. She walked back toward the coach on legs that felt like borrowed things, her head swimming slightly from the fall, her ribs aching from where she'd caught the door handle on the way out. The battered trunk that contained everything she owned had been thrown from the roof and now lay open in the scrub grass, her books and her carefully folded dresses scattered across 20 feet of ground. She went to gather them. Victor watched her. "Leave it," he said. She kept moving, picking up a copy of McGuffey's Reader, checking its spine, setting it on the ground. "Abigail." His voice had gone flat. "I said leave it." "These are my books." She picked up another. "I'm not leaving them." The silence that followed had a particular texture. She knew it well. It was the quiet before he decided which version of himself he was going to be. The charming one or the other one. In public, it was almost always the charming one. "Your books?" He said it the way someone says something they find faintly ridiculous. "We're stranded 20 miles from the nearest town in 100-degree heat, and you're worried about your books." "I'm worried about getting to Blackstone Crossing." She stood up with an armful of texts and carried them to the trunk. "Same as I've been worried about it since we left Abilene." Victor crossed his arms. The merchant and his wife were pointedly looking at the horizon. "I've been meaning to speak with you about that," Victor said. Something in his voice made her stop. She turned. He had that look, the one she'd seen before, when he told her his mother thought she was unsuitable, when he explained why she shouldn't apply for the teaching post in Wichita, when he described at length and with remarkable patience the many ways in which she failed to meet the standards he'd set for a wife. "I don't think Blackstone Crossing is going to work," he said. The heat pressed down on her head like a hand. "What?" "I've had time to think on this journey." He was choosing his words with the deliberateness of a man who'd already made his decision and was now arranging justifications. Abigail, be honest with yourself. You're not suited to frontier life. The teaching post, the whole notion of it, it was a fantasy. You'd be miserable. You told me it was a wonderful opportunity. You told me—" "I was trying to be encouraging." He shrugged. "I've since reconsidered." She stared at him. The dust settled around her feet. Somewhere nearby a locust screamed in the grass. The axle lay broken in the road. "Victor," she said slowly, "what are you saying?" He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope, which he held out toward her. "There's $40 in there, enough for a ticket back to Cincinnati and a few weeks' lodging while you arrange yourself." She didn't take it. "The driver says there's a settlement 2 miles east," Victor continued. "Someone will be along eventually. You're a capable woman. You'll manage." "You're leaving me here." "I'm offering you a graceful exit from a situation that wasn't going to serve either of us." He set the envelope on top of her open trunk, as though he were leaving a tip for a hotel maid. "I'm sorry, Abigail, but I think you know, if you're honest, that this was never going to—" "Don't," she said. The word came out quiet, quieter than she'd intended, but it stopped him. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she hadn't allowed herself to do in months, maybe years. Victor Hale was handsome, she supposed, in the way that certain objects are handsome. Well-made, properly proportioned, entirely without warmth. He had a square jaw and good teeth, and the sort of confidence that comes not from achievement, but from never having been told no. She had spent 2 years trying to deserve him. Standing there in the red dust with her ribs aching and blood drying on her cheek, she understood, in the particular clear-eyed way that shock sometimes allows, that she had wasted 2 years. She picked up the envelope. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it back down on his trunk, not hers. "Keep your money," she said. "Abigail?" "I said keep it." She turned back to her own trunk and finished gathering her books, her hands moving steadily, even though something was burning in her chest that she would not let out. Not here, not in front of him. "I'm going to Blackstone Crossing. That's what I came to do." "You're being foolish." "Probably." She closed the trunk lid and stood up. Her ribs screamed. She breathed through it. "Goodbye, Victor." She picked up one end of the trunk and dragged it. It was heavy, too heavy to carry alone across 2 miles of open prairie. She knew that. She dragged it anyway. She heard Victor say something else behind her, something with the word ridiculous in it, but she had stopped listening, and after a moment she heard his footsteps going in the other direction, toward the northern road, away from her, and she did not look back. She walked for about 300 yards before she had to stop and sit on the trunk and press her hand against her ribs and breathe very carefully. She was not going to cry. She was not going to cry here, in this dust, over Victor Hale. She breathed. The prairie was enormous and terribly indifferent around her. Heat shimmered off the ground. The sky overhead had gone white with it. She could see in the far distance the faint brown smudge that might be a settlement, might be trees, might be nothing. She thought about turning back. She thought about $40 and a train ticket to Cincinnati, and her mother's house, and the particular look her mother always got, not unkind exactly, but tired. The look of a woman who had expected her daughter to have solved the problem of herself by now. She thought about the letter she'd written to the Blackstone Crossing Town Council, careful and formal and measured, laying out her qualifications. 3 years of study, a certificate from the Cincinnati Normal School, experience tutoring the Haynes children and the Morrison girls. She thought about the letter they'd sent back, cautious but open. "We are in need of a qualified instructor. Present yourself in September." September was 6 weeks away. The smudge on the horizon was probably a settlement. She stood up. She gripped the trunk handle. She started walking. The settlement of Blackstone Crossing did not announce itself. There was no grand approach, no arch over the road, no sign that would have made a person feel they were arriving somewhere intentional. The town materialized around her gradually. First a water trough beside the road, then a fence line, then a cluster of buildings that looked as though they'd been set down in a hurry and hadn't yet decided if they were staying. A general store with a warped porch, a livery with the wide doors open, a 2-story structure that might have been a hotel, or might have been a boarding house, or might have been both at once. Abigail arrived dragging her trunk, bleeding, sweating through her dress, and attracting stares before she'd taken 20 steps down the main street. She was used to being stared at. Usually it was because of her size. She was a large woman, had been since girlhood, broad through the shoulders and heavy through the middle, in a way that certain decades and certain social circles decided was a character flaw. She had spent years trying to minimize the space she occupied, folding herself down, speaking softly, apologizing for being present. It had not made her smaller. It had only made her quieter. Now she was too hot and too tired, and her ribs hurt too much to fold herself down for anyone. She stopped in front of the general store and straightened her back and looked at the woman who had paused on the porch to stare at her. "Is there a physician in this town?" Abigail asked. The woman, middle-aged, sharp-eyed, in a calico dress, looked her up and down with the frank assessment of someone accustomed to sizing up new arrivals. "Doc Hennessy. Down the end of the street, left side." "Thank you." Abigail started walking. "You come in on the Abilene stage?" "The remains of it." "Anyone else hurt?" Abigail thought about Victor and his jacket cuff. "No," she said. "Just me." She found Doc Hennessy's office, a narrow room attached to the back of a barber shop, smelling of camphor and old wood, and sat in the chair he indicated while he cleaned the cut on her cheek with something that burned considerably, checked her ribs with practiced hands, and told her 2 were cracked but none broken, which she ought to consider good news. "I consider it acceptable news," she said. He wrapped her middle tight with strips of cotton and told her not to lift anything heavy for 3 weeks. She thanked him, paid him 75 cents from the small reserve she'd sewn into the lining of her traveling bag, and went back out into the street. She stood on the step outside his office and took stock. She had a battered trunk, approximately $14, 2 cracked ribs, a cut cheek, a teaching post that didn't start for 6 weeks, and no lodging. She did not have Victor, a return ticket, or anything that could reasonably be called a plan. The afternoon was tipping toward evening. The light had gone from white to gold, and the heat had eased by perhaps 5 degrees, which still left it at roughly unbearable. A dog lay under the water trough at the end of the street, supremely unconcerned with everything. Abigail sat down on her trunk on the step outside the doctor's office and thought, the general store. The woman on the porch had looked like someone who knew things. Abigail picked up her trunk, ignoring her rib's immediate objection, and carried it back up the street. The woman was still there, shelling beans into a bowl on her lap with the practiced speed of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. She looked up as Abigail climbed the porch steps. "Still here," she observed. "Still here," Abigail agreed. "I'm Abigail Carter. I've been hired as the new school teacher. I don't start until September, and I need lodging in the meantime. Is there anyone in this town who lets rooms?" The woman studied her with that frank, assessing gaze. "Martha Greer," she said. "This is my store, and I've got 2 rooms upstairs. Usually they're for my sister when she comes down from Dodge, but she won't be down till November. What are your finances?" "Limited." "How limited?" "About $14. Martha Greer shelled 3 more beans. $1 a week. You do some work around the store. We'll call it square. I'll need to know you're not going to cause trouble." "I'm a school teacher," Abigail said. "I'm professionally obligated to be the most boring person in any room." Martha Greer looked at her cut cheek, her dusty dress, her trunk dragged across 2 miles of open prairie. Then something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Room's up the back stairs. Dinner's at 6. No. The room was small and clean, and the window looked out over the back lot, where Martha kept a kitchen garden and a pen with 3 goats who stared at Abigail with yellow eyes when she leaned out to get some air. The mattress was firm enough to be honest about itself. There was a washstand and a mirror and a hook on the wall where she hung her second-best dress. She looked at herself in the mirror while she washed her face. This was something she usually avoided. Mirrors had been instruments of evidence growing up, proof of the prosecution's case. Too much of this, not enough of that. Victor had used mirrors against her in his way, not by pointing at them, but by sighing at them, by comparing her in small casual ways to women he described as more refined, as better maintained, as more disciplined. He'd never called her ugly outright. He'd been far too clever for that. She looked at herself now. The cut on her cheek was an angry red line that would bruise by morning. Her hair had gone halfway out of its pins and then given up, and she'd pulled the rest of it loose on the walk, so it hung down to her shoulders in dark waves still damp from sweat. Her eyes were fine. She had always privately thought her eyes were fine. A deep brown that went nearly black in low light, set wide in a face that was round and full and not the fashion. She was 31 years old. She was standing in a back room in a frontier town she'd never heard of a year ago. She had $14 and 2 cracked ribs, and no one in the world who currently knew exactly where she was. She felt, under the exhaustion and the pain and the residue of Victor's $40 envelope, something strange. Something that took her a moment to identify. She felt not happy, not yet, not even close, but free. The sensation was unfamiliar enough to be alarming. She pressed her hand against the cool wall of the room and let herself feel it anyway. She met Cole Mercer the next morning, and it was not a graceful meeting. She had been in Martha Greer's store for approximately 40 minutes, helping to bring in a delivery of flour sacks from the back wagon, which she was doing against her rib's strong recommendation and her own better judgment, but she'd told Martha she'd work, and she intended to mean it. She was maneuvering a 50-pound sack around the corner of the shelving unit When the door opened and the bag slipped and she staggered sideways into the man who'd just come through the door, dropping the flour sack directly onto his left boot. There was a pause. "I'm sorry," Abigail said, stepping back and reaching down for the sack simultaneously, which her ribs punished her for immediately. She caught her breath. "I'm very sorry. Are you—" She straightened up and got her first look at him. He was tall, not unusually so, but solidly built. The kind of build that came from actual work rather than the gymnasium, broad through the chest and shoulders in a way that his worn canvas coat couldn't quite contain. He had dark hair that needed cutting, jaw that needed shaving, and gray eyes that were watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not the amusement she expected, not irritation, not the particular assessing look men gave large women to establish the hierarchy early. He was looking at her the way someone looks at a thing they're genuinely curious about. "I'm fine," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "You all right?" "Perfectly." She picked up the flour sack. He moved then, not taking it from her exactly, but getting a hand under the far end so they were sharing the weight. Without being asked. "Where's it going?" "Third shelf, the back row." They carried it together. He set his end down first, and she set hers down, and she turned to find him studying the way she'd been holding her left side. "Ribs?" he said. "Cracked, not broken." "Stage accident?" "You heard. Town this size, everyone heard." He wasn't apologetic about it, just matter of fact. "Cole Mercer," he said. "I've got a ranch 4 miles out." "Abigail Carter. I'm going to be the school teacher." He nodded as though this made complete sense. He didn't look her over. He didn't do the small wince of reassessment she'd learned to anticipate when men discovered she was a woman of some education. The recalibration of their expectations downward, as though intelligence and her particular body were somehow mutually exclusive. He just nodded, as though she'd said a fact he was filing for later use, and then went to the counter to ask Martha about a shipment of grain. Abigail went back to the flour sacks. She was obscurely annoyed. She couldn't have said why. Perhaps because she'd been braced for something and nothing had come. Perhaps because his eyes had been direct without being invasive, and she wasn't sure what to do with that. Perhaps because she was still in enough pain that everything was slightly irritating. She moved 3 more sacks. On her 4th trip out to the wagon, she heard Martha's voice from the store. "Heard you got the contract for the South pasture water." And Cole's voice, level. "Hoping to. Crawford's got his men all over it." Crawford always has his men all over something. A pause and the sound of a pencil on paper. "That man's been trying to swallow this valley for 3 years." "He's efficient at it," Cole said. "I'll give him that much." Abigail kept moving. She filed the names away. Crawford, South pasture water, 3 years, with the automatic habit of someone who had learned to pay attention to the texture of a place before trying to navigate it. She came back in with the last sack to find Cole still at the counter, looking at a piece of paper Martha had pushed across it. His face had gone flat, in the way that wasn't blankness but containment. Whatever he was thinking, he'd decided not to let it out. "When did this come in?" he said. "Yesterday's mail. Figured you'd want to know." He folded the paper and put it in his jacket and picked up his hat. As he turned to go, he noticed Abigail standing by the shelves with the last flour sack. "That's the 4th one since I walked in," he said. "And?" "Hennessy told you to stay off heavy lifting for 3 weeks. She set the sack down on the shelf. "Hennessy doesn't own this town." "No." Something shifted in his face, that almost smile that wasn't quite. "Fair enough." He put his hat on and walked out. The story of Blackstone Crossing assembled itself around Abigail over the following 2 weeks, the way all small-town stories do, in fragments from multiple sources, with contradictions and silences that told their own tale. The valley had been open range 15 years ago, settled gradually by ranchers and homesteaders who'd come looking for good water and stayed because they found it. The Mercer Ranch was one of the oldest, built by Cole's father on land he'd bought legal and fenced legal and worked for 2 decades before he died. Cole had inherited it at 26 and kept it going through 3 hard winters and a drought year that had broken 6 other operations in the territory. Crawford was newer. He'd arrived 7 years ago with Eastern money and a land agent and had been buying up claims ever since, some of them willing sales, some of them less so. Some of them, it was whispered, not sales at all, but paperwork that appeared after the original holders had been persuaded to leave. He owned the mill now, and 3 ranches, and had recently acquired, through methods that made the town's older residents quiet when asked, the rights to the main tributary that fed the valley's south pasture. "He's not illegal exactly," said a man named Tate, who ran the livery and had become one of Abigail's more useful sources. He had the rolling diction of someone who'd grown up on the prairie and the directness of a man who'd spent 40 years talking to horses. "Legal enough for a court to have trouble with it, is what he is. And courts are far off. Is there a sheriff?" Tate made a sound. "Sheriff Crane, he's there." "That's not reassuring." "No," Tate agreed. "It ain't." She talked to the wives at the water trough and the older children who came to see the schoolhouse, not yet open, but visible, a clapboard building at the end of the main street that smelled of fresh paint and possibility. And she talked to Martha Greer in the evenings over plates of beans and cornbread. She began to understand the valley as a thing with a weight in it, a slow pressure that had been building for years, and the particular fatigue of people who had been resisting that pressure for so long, they'd almost forgotten what it felt like before. She saw Cole Mercer 3 more times in those 2 weeks, each time briefly. Once in the street, passing in opposite directions, where he tipped his hat and she nodded. Once at the general store again, where he was picking up fence wire and she was returning a borrowed pot to Martha's kitchen, and they exchanged maybe 8 words total about nothing in particular. Once at the end of the main street at dusk, where she'd gone to look at the schoolhouse because she did that sometimes, stood and looked at it the way she'd look at a promise she wasn't sure she believed yet. He was standing at the fence across the road, looking at something to the south, and he didn't speak, and she didn't speak, and they both looked at their separate things for maybe 5 minutes before he said, without turning, "Town Council's meeting Thursday, if you're wanting to introduce yourself before September." "Is that an invitation?" "It's information." She looked at him. The light was going red and long across the flats, and his face was in half shadow, and she still couldn't read what he was. Not dangerous, she was fairly sure. She'd learned to read dangerous. She had years of practice. Not simple either, which would have been easier. Something in between that she didn't have a category for. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and walked back toward where he'd left his horse, and she went back to looking at the schoolhouse, and the evening settled down around both of them without requiring anything further. Thursday came, and Abigail put on her best dress, the blue wool, which was too heavy for the heat, but was the most authoritative thing she owned, and walked into the town council meeting with her teaching certificate in one hand and 4 months of lesson plans in the other. And she felt, for all of it, precisely as terrified as she did precisely as resolved. The council met in the back room of the saloon, which was the largest space in town, and there were 7 men sitting around 2 tables pushed together, and they looked at her the way she'd been looked at her whole life. The assessment, the slight hesitation, the recalibration. And she let them look, because she couldn't stop them anyway. She sat down when she was invited to sit, and she laid her materials on the table, and when the chairman, a heavy-set man named Aldous Briggs, who smelled of pipe smoke and wore his skepticism plainly, asked her to explain her qualifications, she told him. She told him clearly and in sequence and without apology. 3 years of study, the Cincinnati Normal School Certificate, 5 years of tutoring experience, 4 private pupils, with specific outcomes. Young Thomas Haynes had entered the state Latin examination and placed 3rd in his county. The Morrison girls were both accepted to the Cleveland Female Seminary. She had designed curricula for ages 6 through 14, had experience managing a classroom of mixed ages and abilities, had additional training in geography and natural history from the Cincinnati Public Library lecture series. She laid out the lesson plans. She'd structured the first year by term, by age group, by subject, with assessments and reading lists and a proposed schedule that accounted for the fact that frontier children had farm responsibilities that eastern children didn't. The room was quiet when she finished. Aldous Briggs was looking at the lesson plans with an expression that was harder to read than she'd expected. The man beside him, younger, with a weathered look and ink-stained fingers, who had introduced himself as the town's part-time postmaster and printer, was reading the curriculum outline with what appeared to be genuine attention. "You came out here alone?" said one of the men at the end of the table. He didn't sound hostile, exactly, more confused, as though it required explanation. I came out on the stage, she said. The stage had an accident. I walked the last 2 miles. 2 miles, Briggs repeated. With a trunk. A short silence. The printer, his name was Garrett Ellis, she'd learn later, looked up from the curriculum outline. You've got reading lists for 3 different age groups for the full first year already planned out. I had time on the journey. You had time on a stage journey to write 3 reading lists. I also slept, she said, and ate. I didn't spend the entire journey on lesson plans, though. She paused, and some part of her that had survived Victor in Cincinnati and 2 miles of hot prairie decided to stop folding herself down. If there's a more efficient use of travel time than planning for your new position, I haven't found it. Something shifted in the room. She couldn't say exactly what. Some adjustment in the collective posture, some reconsideration happening simultaneously among 7 men. It was Garrett Ellis who laughed first. It was a short sound, but genuine. No, he said. I suppose there isn't. They offered her the post by the end of the meeting. $6 a month, the schoolhouse, and use of the small storeroom attached for lodging once she was ready to move from Martha's. September 1st start date. She shook hands around the table, and when she got to the far end, she found Cole Mercer, whom she hadn't noticed was there because he'd come in late and sat at the back. I didn't see you, she said. I was quiet. You vote in favor? Yes. Why? He considered this. He had a way of considering things before answering that she'd begun to recognize as a habit rather than hesitation. He was thinking, actually thinking, rather than performing consideration. Because you came in here with 4 months of lesson plans and told Aldous Briggs to his face that you knew how to do your job, and you weren't wrong. She looked at him. That's a practical reason, she said. I'm a practical man. She nodded. She tucked her certificate under her arm and walked out into the August night, and behind her she heard the men of Blackstone Crossing beginning to talk about other things. The mill contract, the water rights, Crawford's latest move on the eastern pasture, and she walked home in the dark, and her ribs ached and her feet hurt, and she was still $61 from having an emergency reserve, and she was very tired. She sat on Martha's porch for a while in the dark, listening to the night sounds, the crickets and the distant call of something in the hills, and she thought about the teaching post, and the schoolhouse, and the lesson plans she'd written on the stage while Victor slept in the seat beside her with his arms folded and his face set in its habitual expression of mild disappointment. She thought about the way she'd felt walking into that meeting room, the weight of the lesson plans in her hands, the fact that she had them, the fact that no one had told her to make them. She'd made them because she was going to do this job, and she was going to do it right, and she had not needed Victor's opinion on that, or anyone else's. She sat in the dark and listened to the Blackstone Crossing night, and the strange, free feeling came back, quieter now, but steadier. And she let it stay this time. She was here. Whatever came next, she was here. September arrived the way it always does on the prairie, without announcing itself, the heat simply backing off 1 degree at a time. Until one morning, a person walked outside and the air had an edge to it, faint but real. The first suggestion that the world was capable of change. Abigail noticed it on the walk to the schoolhouse, the first Monday of the month, which was also the first day of school. She was carrying a stack of primers under one arm and a box of chalk in her other hand, and she'd been up since before light, which had allowed her to be nervous in private for several hours before she had to be composed in public. The schoolhouse was a single room, 20 feet by 30, with 8 windows that actually opened and a small iron stove in the corner and 2 rows of benches that the men of the town had built over the summer from pine boards that still bled a little sap in the heat. Someone, she suspected Garrett Ellis, who had turned out to be a quiet ally in the ways that mattered, had put a map of the United States on the front wall, the kind with the territories marked in different colors. It was slightly crooked. She'd straightened it 3 times, and it had gone crooked again on its own, so she'd left it. She'd laid out the primers the night before, 1 per bench. She'd written the date on the chalkboard. She'd moved the stove's pipe twice because the draft wasn't right, burning her hand the second time, which was her own fault for not using the cloth she'd set out specifically to avoid that. Now she stood in the doorway and looked at the room and took 1 breath. Then she turned around and looked down the street, and they were coming. Not all at once. No dramatic procession, nothing like that. They came in 1s and 2s and small clusters, and they were various ages and sizes and expressions of reluctance. A girl of about 8 with braids that someone had plaited neatly and a dress that was clean but 2 sizes too large. 2 boys who were clearly brothers, walking with that particular energy of children who have made a private bet about something. A girl of 12 or 13 who walked with her arms crossed and her eyes already scanning the room for exits. 3 younger children who arrived with their mother, who looked at Abigail with the careful expression of a woman trying to assess whether this stranger was going to be good for her children. Abigail counted 14 by the time the last one came in. A boy of about 10 who appeared to have fallen in something on the way and was trying to appear as though he hadn't. She looked at them. They looked at her. "I'm Miss Carter," she said. "You're going to sit where I tell you, and we're going to start with your names." She learned 23 things in the first week. She learned that the Hendricks brothers, the ones who'd made the private bet, were called William and James, 9 and 11 respectively, and that they were sharp in the way that boys are when they've had to be, their father having broken his leg in July and the oldest brother having gone to help with harvest on a farm to the north, leaving these two to carry more than their share. She learned that the girl with the braids was named Clara Tate, Tate the liveryman's youngest daughter, and that she read at a level 3 years beyond her age and was too polite to show it in front of the other children, which Abigail noted and stored for later. She learned that the 12-year-old with her arms crossed was Nora Phelps, whose mother had died in the spring, and who did not talk in class but wrote answers on her slate that were more precise and more considered than anyone else's, and who on the third day left a folded piece of paper on Abigail's desk that contained a question about the Louisiana Purchase that had clearly been bothering her for some time. She learned that the stove smoked when the wind was from the northeast, that 4 of the younger children had never held a pencil before, that the bench third from the right had a loose board that caught ankles, and that the best time to get Clara to read aloud to the class was right after the midday break, when the room was warm and the other children were slower to interrupt. She learned that teaching 14 children of different ages in one room was harder than anything she'd imagined and exactly as rewarding as she'd hoped, and that at the end of each day she went home to Martha's back room and ate her dinner and fell asleep over whatever she'd planned to mark, and that this was the most tired she'd been in years, and also, quietly, the most herself. The town watched. She was aware of it in the measured way of being aware of weather, not looking at it directly, but noting its pressure. The women at the water trough asked after the children's progress with a care that was really asking something else. Is she staying? Is she real? Is she what she said she was? The men at the feed store mentioned things their sons had said at dinner with the studied nonchalance of fathers who didn't want to admit they were interested. Martha Greer, who expressed approval through the provision of larger dinner portions rather than words, had been increasing the amount of cornbread on Abigail's plate since the second week of term. By the end of October, the verdict of Blackstone Crossing had begun to form. She heard it from Garrett Ellis first, in the oblique way he delivered most things. Aldous Briggs told his wife the Hendricks boy can do his sums now, front to back without the board. He could already do them, Abigail said. He just didn't know he could. Garrett considered this. That might be more useful, he said. So, she was teaching, which meant she was busy in the way that leaves a person too engaged for certain varieties of self-doubt. The particular species of misery she'd brought with her from Cincinnati, the chronic, low-grade conviction that she was too much and not enough simultaneously, had not vanished. It still surfaced on difficult mornings and in quiet evenings, and occasionally in the middle of lessons when she caught a certain kind of look from a parent in the doorway and couldn't immediately determine whether it was approving or not. But it surfaced into a different kind of life now, and she didn't have time to sit with it the way she once had. And that turned out to make a difference. She thought about Victor less than she expected. When she did think about him, it was with a dull, specific anger rather than grief. Anger at time spent, at the careful, slow work he'd done on her sense of herself, at the $40 envelope with its implication that she was a problem to be managed at minimum cost. She did not miss him. She was not sure she had ever actually missed him during the whole of the 2 years she'd spent trying to be what he wanted. What she occasionally missed was the idea of not being alone. That was different. She moved into the schoolhouse storeroom in October, when the nights turned cold and the second room at Martha's was needed for a family passing through who needed it worse. The storeroom had a cot and a small table and a window that looked into the schoolyard. And if she lay in bed and looked at the ceiling, she could sometimes hear the boards of the classroom settling in the cold. And she found this oddly comforting, as though the building were alive in some small way and keeping her company. It was a quiet life, and she was making something of it. And most mornings, that was enough. Cole Mercer came to the schoolhouse on a Tuesday afternoon in late October unannounced, which was apparently his general approach to everything. She was alone. The children had gone an hour before, sitting at the front bench with a stack of arithmetic slates and a headache that had started around noon and hadn't resolved itself. She heard the door and looked up. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, doing the thing he apparently always did in new spaces, which was look around it carefully before committing to entry. She'd noticed this before, the way he read a room before walking into the middle of it. "Am I interrupting?" he said. "I'm grading arithmetic. Interrupting is relative." She set down the slate she was holding. "Come in or don't?" He came in. He looks at the map on the front wall, crooked still, and at the chalkboard, where she'd left the afternoon's grammar lesson, and at the rows of benches with their layering of small scrapes and pencil marks. "How's it going?" he said. "The children are learning. The stove smokes when the wind is from the northeast. William Hendricks has begun to show off, which means he's stopped being afraid of being wrong, which means we're making progress." Cole looked at the arithmetic slate she'd set down. The marks on it were a child's uncertain numbers, and half of them were right. "Whose is that?" "Clara Tate's. She's been helping the younger ones with their letters, which is good for them and good for her, but it means she's been doing her own arithmetic at home in the evenings, and it shows in her work. Her father mentioned she's been," he paused, choosing words, "more settled since school started. She's clever. She needed somewhere to put it." He nodded. He was looking at the benches again, and she had the sense he was thinking about something that had nothing to do with arithmetic. "What did you actually come for?" she said. He looked at her directly. "Crawford's filed a claim on the Northern Water Access. The one that would cut off the Hendricks family." Something moved in his expression. "You've been paying attention." "I pay attention to everything. It's a professional habit." She folded her hands on the bench. "What does it mean for them?" "Means if it goes through, they can't run cattle past spring. They've got 40 head and no other pasture." He turned the hat in his hands. "There are 3 other families in the same situation." "And you?" "My access is different. I fought that one out 2 years ago." A pause. "But if Crawford takes the northern claim, it changes the geography of the whole valley. He'll have water on 3 sides of the main range." She thought about the map on the wall, its colored territories, its lines that meant control. "What are you doing about it?" "I'm going to Dodge City. I've got a meeting with a land attorney who handles claim disputes. I'll be gone 10 days. He said it evenly, but she had begun to recognize the difference between Cole's evenness and actual indifference. This was not indifference. "I told Garrett and Martha, and now I'm telling you." "Why me?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because if something goes wrong while I'm gone, or something comes up with the families, the Hendricks, the Brennans, I'd rather they knew they could come to you." He said it plainly, without decoration. "You're not involved in it directly. Crawford's people don't have reason to make things difficult for you." She looked at him. "You're asking me to be a point of contact," she said. "I'm asking if you'd be willing." She thought about it for 2 seconds, not because she was uncertain, but because it deserved 2 seconds. "Yes," she said. "Tell the Hendricks and the Brennans they can come to the schoolhouse." Something released in him slightly. Not relief exactly, but some small weight going down. "Thank you," he said. He started for the door. "Cole." She wasn't sure why she said it. He turned. She looked at him standing in the afternoon light from the doorway, hat in his hands. A man who'd come here specifically to ask her this one careful thing. And she thought about the way he'd helped carry the flour sack without being asked, and the town council meeting, and the evenings outside the schoolhouse, and the way he never, not once, looked at her the way men generally looked at her. "Be careful," she said. It came out more direct than she meant it. He looked at her for a moment. "I'll try," he said, and he went. The 10 days he was gone were not quiet. She hadn't expected them to be. She had the school and the children and the routine of it, but the quality of the town's anxiety went up a degree in his absence, and she felt it. The Hendricks family sent their eldest boy, Daniel, who'd come back from the Northern Harvest and was 17 and trying to carry himself like someone older, to the schoolhouse on the third day. He stood in the doorway after the children had left with his hat in his hands, in a gesture that reminded her so strongly of Cole that she had to look away for a moment. "Pa wanted to know," he said, "if there's any word." "Not yet. He said 10 days. It's been 3. Daniel nodded. He was looking at the floor. "Crawford's man came by yesterday. Said he wanted to talk to Pa about the claim. Pa didn't talk to him." "Good. Pa wants to know if he should." Abigail thought about it. "Tell your father to wait for Cole to get back. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. If Crawford's man comes again, tell him the family is awaiting legal counsel." Daniel looked up. "Do we have legal counsel?" "Cole went to get it. That's close enough to true for now." He almost smiled. He was young enough that it showed on his whole face. "Yes, ma'am." After he'd gone, she sat at the front bench and graded the afternoon spelling and listened to the October wind and thought about Crawford's man showing up at the Hendricks farm, and the Hendricks father with his broken leg and 4 children and 40 head of cattle, and the particular arithmetic of a man being asked to trade his water rights for the ability to stay. She had seen that arithmetic before. Not with cattle and water rights, with something smaller but not less real. The trade Victor had offered her again and again in small ways. Agree with me, diminish yourself, sign over the claim on your own judgment, and in exchange I will continue to find you acceptable. She knew what it looked like to be worn down by that arithmetic. She went to see Martha Greer that evening. Martha was closing up the store when Abigail came in, turning the key in the register and making notes in the ledger she kept in her own shorthand. She looked up without slowing down. "You're here about the Hendricks." "And the Brennans. Do you know if Crawford's approached the Brennans?" "Not yet. Give it a week." Martha shut the ledger. "He's systematic about it. The Tillers sold out last year, offered them nothing for land worth 3 times it, but they were tired and Tom Tiller had been sick all winter." She looked at Abigail steadily. "You're thinking about this differently than most people." "What do you mean?" "Most people in this valley see it as a land problem, a money problem." Martha tucked the ledger under the counter. "You're looking at it like what would you call it? A pressure campaign, isn't it?" Martha was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "It is. Crawford's very good at making people tired before he makes them an offer." "Then the answer is to make sure they're not tired alone." Martha looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, with the same quality of decision she probably applied to inventory orders. Direct, final, done. "I'll put the word out, quietly. Women first. The wives talk, and they're the ones holding things together in most of those households anyway." "Don't make it sound like resistance," Abigail said. "Make it sound like community." "Those are the same thing," Martha said, and picked up her coat. Cole came back on the evening of the 10th day. Abigail knew because Tate told her the following morning, with the satisfaction of a man delivering information he knows will be wanted, that Mercer's horse had come in around 9 the previous night, and the man himself had gone straight home without stopping, which probably meant he was exhausted or the news was bad or both. She taught her morning classes. At the midday break, she wrapped up in her coat and walked the 4 miles to the Mercer ranch. This was, she acknowledged as she walked, somewhat forward. She had not been invited. He had been gone 10 days on a trip she knew was difficult, and he had presumably come back to a ranch that needed attending, and it was not strictly her business what the land attorney in Dodge City had said. She walked anyway. The Mercer Ranch was a working ranch in a way that was legible from a quarter-mile out. Not prosperous in the way that spoke of easy money, but solid, maintained. The fences straight and the buildings squared up against the weather with the look of a place that had been regularly repaired rather than allowed to deteriorate and then fixed. The house was timber-framed and added to at least twice, with a front porch that faced west and a kitchen garden on the south side that had gone to late-season stalks. She knocked on the front door. There was a pause, the sound of something being set down, and then Cole opened it. He looked like a man who'd ridden hard for 10 days and slept 4 hours. His face was drawn and his eyes had that particular emptiness of someone running on will rather than rest. He looked at her for a moment. "I walked," she said, "to ask what the attorney said. You don't have to invite me in. He stepped back and opened the door wider. She went in. The inside of the house was what she'd have guessed if she'd guessed. Functional, not uncomfortable, with a quality of long use that was past mere practicality and had settled into something that might be called home if a person were generous. A stone fireplace, a table with one chair pulled out at an angle, which was clearly where he'd been sitting before she knocked. A shelf with 3 books and a stack of papers, and a folded piece of canvas that she suspected was a map. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove without asking. She sat at the table. He sat across from her and put his hands around his cup and looked at it for a moment. The attorney says the Crawford claim is valid on paper, he said. The deed is registered properly. The survey is signed. But the survey is wrong. He looked up. The claim line Crawford filed runs 60 yards north of the actual survey markers on the ground. I rode out there before I left, and I know where those markers are. His deed says one thing, the ground says another. Abigail thought. That's surveyor's fraud. If you can prove it. Can you prove it? I have a surveyor in Dodge who will come out and run new lines. But Crawford will contest it, and the county court is in Wichita, which is 4 days each way, and in the meantime, he stopped, drank coffee. In the meantime, he's entitled to act as if the claim is valid. Which means the Hendricks family has until spring before he can legally restrict their access. If we get the court date before spring, we have a chance. He set the cup down. If we don't, the Hendricks will have to decide whether to fight a court battle they probably can't afford or take whatever Crawford offers them. Abigail looked at the map folded on the shelf. How much would the court proceedings cost? She said. More than the Hendricks have. What about collectively? If the other families contribute, Crawford will know they're doing it. He'll move faster. He'll move faster, regardless. She looked at him. He's already sent a man to the Hendricks farm. Cole's face went flat. When? 3 days after you left. I told Daniel Hendricks to wait for your return and claim they had legal counsel. He looked at her. Did they? He said, and it wasn't entirely a question. They have you, she said. That seemed close enough. He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face shifted. Not the almost smile. Something different. Something that she couldn't categorize yet. The attorney in Dodge, she said. Can he handle the proceedings remotely? File the initial challenge by mail? He said he could, if the survey report and the deed discrepancy are documented properly. Then document them. Get the surveyor out to set new markers. Get the report in writing and mailed to Wichita. She said it clearly, the way she explained a problem to a student who already had the pieces but hadn't arranged them yet. You need the process started before Crawford has a chance to get ahead of it. The families can pool what they can for legal costs. Martha will know who can contribute what. Martha knows everything, Cole said, and this time the almost smile came. She does. Use her. Abigail stood. And sleep. You look like you've been ridden harder than your horse. He looked up at her from the table. Thank you, he said, for the families. While I was gone. She picked up her coat from the chair where she'd set it. I told you I would. I know. I'm thanking you anyway. She looked at him for a moment. This man who thanked people plainly, without performance, without obligation, and felt something she quickly filed in the category of not now and fastened her coat buttons. Send word when the surveyor sets a date, she said. I'll help draft the letter to the attorney. You can do that? I wrote lesson plans for 4 months on a stagecoach, she said. I can write a legal letter. He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, and it was a real one. Not a polite sound, but a genuine startled laugh, too short but unguarded. And it changed his face in a way she carried with her for the whole 4 miles back to town. November came in cold and mean, with a wind that found every gap in the schoolhouse walls, and Abigail organized the children into a project of identifying the drafts and stuffing them with newspaper and spare wool, which served both the practical purpose of insulating the room and the educational purpose of teaching them to assess a problem systematically. William Hendricks told her at the end of the project that he reckoned she'd got them to fix the whole building without them noticing they were doing work, which she considered one of her better teaching achievements. The legal letter to the Wichita court went out by the end of November. Cole's surveyor came in the second week of the month, ran his lines, filed his report, which documented the 60-yard discrepancy in Crawford's deed with the dispassionate precision of a man who'd seen this kind of thing before and knew exactly what it meant, and departed for Dodge City with the papers. Crawford, who apparently had sources in the Postal Service or simply paid attention, sent a representative to town 3 days after the letter went out. The representative was a lawyer, a smooth, careful man named Dillard, who wore a good coat and had the manner of someone who'd learned to make propositions sound like courtesies. He met with Aldous Briggs and Garrett Ellis and 2 of the other council members, and what he said, politely and at some length, was that his client was prepared to be generous in resolving the survey discrepancy if the community would prefer to avoid the time and expense of a court proceeding. He did not say your surveyor is wrong. He said these disagreements can take years to resolve, and in the meantime, uncertainty is bad for everyone. Abigail heard about it from Garrett that evening. What did they say? She asked. Briggs thanked him for his time. Nobody committed to anything. Garrett was quiet for a moment. But Briggs is worried. The court process scares him. He's got the mill contract to think about, and Crawford owns part of the road the supply wagons use. Crawford owns part of the road? Bought it 2 years ago. Nobody noticed it mattered until lately. Abigail turned this over. He's built a grid, she said. Garrett looked at her. He's not just buying land, she said. He's buying leverage. Every piece he acquires makes the other pieces matter more. If you fight him on the water, he tightens on the road. If you fight him on the road, he has another move. She thought about Crawford's man at the Hendricks farm, the tillers who'd sold out when Tom Tiller was sick, the mill contract. It's a patient strategy. It is, Garrett said. He was quiet. The question is whether we have anything he wants enough to negotiate with, or whether we're just waiting for the court. We have the school, she said. Garrett frowned. What do you mean? Crawford wants this valley to be productive. He needs labor, ranchers, farmers, families who stay. Families with children. She thought it through as she said it. He can push out the older generation by controlling water and roads, but if the families leave, the valley loses half its value. He's not trying to empty the valley, he's trying to own it. She looked at Garrett. If enough families with children are publicly, visibly committed to staying, building, investing, enrolling their children in school for the long term, it changes his calculation. Garrett considered this for a long time. You're thinking about the school's enrollment numbers, he said slowly. I'm thinking about what it means when 12 families publicly commit to being here next year and the year after. She looked at him. That's not nothing. That's a counterweight. She wasn't sure if she was right. It was a theory, not a plan, incomplete, dependent on variables she couldn't control. But Garrett was nodding in the slow, careful way of someone absorbing something that shifts their view of a problem, and she thought that was probably a start. She told Cole about it the following Sunday, when he came by the schoolhouse with fence wire for a repair he'd offered to make on the schoolyard gate. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to understand was his way. He listened the whole way through, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke. You're right that he needs families to stay, Cole said. He was working the wire as he talked, his hands doing the job without needing his eyes on it. But he can wait out a few families. He's got the capital for it. He can wait out a few, she agreed. Can he wait out the whole valley? Cole looked up. Martha's already talking to the women, she said. Garrett's going to put a notice in his paper. Enrollment for the spring term. If we get numbers, it becomes a statement. Crawford'll know what it means. Yes. Which means he'll push harder in other ways. Probably. She held the wire taut while he fastened it, and for a moment they were working together in the easy, uncomplicated way that she'd noticed had become natural between them. Not intimate, not formal, simply a kind of practical fluency that had grown up between two people who'd been solving adjacent problems together for several months. But pushing harder takes time, and it makes noise. And noise is bad for a man whose strategy depends on everyone else staying quiet. He secured the last wire and straightened. You've been thinking about this a long time, he said. Since October. You didn't say. I wasn't sure yet. I'm still not entirely sure. She wound the loose end of wire around the spool and handed it back to him. But it seemed worth saying. He took the spool. His fingers briefly overlapped hers in the transfer. Just a moment, the contact of the handover. And neither of them made anything of it, and both of them were entirely aware of it. And he looked at the gate latch, and she looked at the schoolyard, and the moment passed cleanly into whatever it was going to become later. Spring enrollment, he said. Yes. He nodded and picked up his tools, and the afternoon settled down around them both, full of what was unspoken and what was decided, and the particular useful quality of a silence shared between two people who have begun, without quite choosing to trust each other. The spring enrollment notice ran in Garrett Ellis's paper on the first Friday of December, and by the following Monday, 9 families had sent word that their children would be returning in January. By Wednesday, it was 13. By the end of the week, Abigail had more students enrolled for the spring term than she had benches to seat them. She told Cole on Sunday, when he came by to check the gate repair he'd made had held through the first real cold snap. He looked at the number she'd written on a piece of paper and handed to him, and something moved in his face that she'd come to recognize as the particular expression he wore when something had gone better than he'd expected, and he wasn't sure yet how to account for it. 17, he said. 18, as of this morning. The Brennan twins. He looked at the number for another moment, and then handed the paper back to her. Crawford's man Dillard left town yesterday, he said. I heard it from Tate. Does that mean something? Means Crawford got the message and is thinking about it. He turned his coat collar up against the wind. Or means he's pulling back before he advances somewhere else. With Crawford, it's usually the latter. She tucked the paper into her coat pocket. 17, now 18, names, and behind each name a family that had decided, for whatever mixture of reasons, that they were staying in this valley and sending their children to be educated and were willing to say so publicly. It was not a legal strategy. It was not a court filing. It was a different kind of statement, quieter and harder to counter. You think the court date will come through before spring? She said. The attorney in Wichita wrote back. He says February, maybe March. Depends on the docket. Cole was looking at the far line of hills to the south, the dark ridge that divided the valley from the open range. Crawford will try to settle before then. He doesn't want a court decision on record. If a judge rules the survey is fraudulent, every other deed he's filed in this territory gets scrutinized. That's his actual exposure, she said. That's his actual exposure. The wind came up and moved the bare branches of the single cottonwood in the schoolyard, and the gate swung and held, and they stood in the cold for a moment longer before Abigail said she had marking to do, and Cole said he had a fence line to check before dark, and they separated with the ordinary directness of two people who have run out of immediate business but are in no hurry about the leaving. She watched him ride out until the road curved, then went inside. Christmas came to Blackstone Crossing the way it came to most frontier settlements, with homemade decoration, a collective determination to make something out of the dark month, and the particular warmth of people who were isolated enough to take celebrations seriously. Martha Greer hung pine boughs in the store window. Garrett Ellis printed a short piece in his paper about the first year of the school, which mentioned enrollment numbers and quoted Abigail briefly and without her prior knowledge, which she discovered by reading it along with everyone else. The quote was accurate, at least. She'd said it to Garrett 3 weeks before. The purpose of a school in a place like this isn't just reading and arithmetic. It's giving children a reason to believe their town has a future. She'd said it offhandedly, in the middle of a conversation about the spring term, and hadn't thought much of it. Looking at it in print was a different sensation, seeing something you'd meant privately become public property. People stopped her on the street to mention it. Claire Tate's father shook her hand outside the livery. Even Aldous Briggs, who had not entirely warmed to her in the months since the council meeting, stopped her outside the general store and said, in his gruff, reluctant way, that the piece reflected well on the town. She thanked him. She went home to her storeroom and sat on her cot and thought about how strange it was to be in a place where people were glad you were there. She was not entirely sure how to accommodate it. Gratitude had always been a complicated thing to receive. It required believing you'd earned it, and she was still working on that particular piece of infrastructure. Cole came to town on Christmas Eve, which was not unusual. He came to town most weeks for supplies or to check in with Garrett or to work on the ongoing Crawford legal correspondence. What was unusual was that he came to the schoolhouse rather than the store, and he was carrying a package under his arm. And when she opened the door, he held it out to her with the direct simplicity of a man who had decided to do a thing and was doing it. "What is this?" she said. "Open it." She unwrapped it on the table while he stood by the door, and it was a book. A large one, dark bound, the title embossed in gold on the front, a complete atlas of North America, with territorial surveys and geographic indexes, the kind of book she'd have needed to save 3 months to buy herself. She turned it over in her hands. "The map on the wall is wrong in 7 places," Cole said. "I noticed when I was in here in October." She looked up. "You counted?" I looked. He had his hands in his coat pockets. "Figured you'd want an accurate one. For the children." She looked back at the atlas. It was a good book. She could see that immediately, the quality of the paper and the precision of the maps, the kind of reference that would last 20 years if treated with care. She thought about the map on the wall, crooked, 7 errors, and Cole standing in her classroom noticing both things. "Thank you," she said. It came out more quiet than she intended. "You're welcome." He was already moving toward the door. "Happy Christmas, Abigail." He'd used her name. He almost never used her name. She said, "Happy Christmas, Cole." And he went out and she sat with the atlas in her hands for a long time after he'd gone. January brought the cold in earnest, and with it the spring term, and Abigail had 18 students and not enough benches, which was a good problem to have. Cole and Daniel Hendricks showed up on the first Saturday of January with lumber and built 2 new rows of benches in an afternoon, declining payment with the quiet stubbornness of men who've decided a thing is a community contribution and are not going to be argued out of it. She taught. She was good at it. Better than she'd been in September, which was already better than she'd been in Cincinnati, where she'd tutored individual children in parlors and had the resources but not the full immersion. She was learning the particular discipline of a one-room school, how to hold 4 age groups simultaneously, how to set one group to independent work while she ran a lesson with another, how to use the older students to reinforce the younger ones without making either group feel the arrangement was anything other than natural. Nora Phelps, who had spent the fall term with her arms crossed and her mouth closed, had opened up by increments through the winter until she was now one of the most reliably engaged students in the room. Not the loudest, she was never going to be the loudest, but the one who left the most densely written responses on her slate, and who asked the questions that made the room go quiet, because everyone suddenly realized they'd been wondering the same thing. Abigail had begun leaving Nora a book on her bench once a week, just left there, with no comment, no assignment. The first week Nora had picked it up with the careful suspicion of someone expecting a condition attached. By the 4th week she was returning it with pencil notes in the margins. Light, careful notes, not damaging the pages. Observations about what she'd read. Abigail read those notes before she gave the next book. This was, she thought, what she had come here to do. The court date came through in the 2nd week of February, the 19th in Wichita. Cole and the Wichita attorney would present the survey discrepancy evidence before a territorial judge, and Crawford's legal team would contest it, and the outcome would determine whether the Northern water claim stood or fell. The valley held its breath. Abigail kept teaching. She was aware that keeping teaching was itself a kind of argument, that every day the school ran, every family that sent their children, every pencil mark on every slate was a data point in the case she'd been making since October. She was also aware that this was partly a way of not thinking too hard about the court date and what it meant and whether they had done enough. Cole left for Wichita on February 15th. He came to the schoolhouse the evening before. It was late. The children had been gone for hours. And she was alone, drafting a letter to the Cincinnati Normal School requesting additional curriculum materials. The knock came after 8, which was late enough to be unusual, and she opened the door to find him on the step with his hat in his hands. "Leaving tomorrow," he said. "I know." "Early?" "Before light." She stepped back. "Come in." He came in. He sat at one of the student benches, too small for him, slightly absurd, which she suspected he was aware of, and she made coffee on the small iron burner she'd acquired in November, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight. "You're not worried," she said. It was not quite a question. "I'm worried," he said. "I'm just not the kind of worried that talking about it helps." She understood that completely. "The evidence is solid," she said instead. "The evidence is solid. Whether the judge agrees is a different question." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Crawford's attorney is good. He'll find the procedural angles. He'll try to delay, maybe get a continuance, run the clock until the families are too tired to keep fighting it. That's been his whole strategy from the beginning. Yes. Then the answer to that is what it's always been. Make sure the families don't get tired. She looked at him. That's what the school is. That's what Martha and Garrett and the enrollment numbers are. He can run the clock on a legal proceeding, but he can't run the clock on a community that's visibly not going anywhere. Cole was quiet. You sound certain, he said. Not dismissive, actually listening. I'm not certain. I'm resolved. She set her cup down. Those aren't the same thing. He looked at her in the lamplight, and the look held for a moment longer than the practical requirements of the conversation. There was something in it. Not the almost smile, not the careful assessment she'd seen in October and November. Something that was both more direct and more difficult to name. When I came back from Dodge in October, he said, and you walked 4 miles to ask me what the attorney said. I was direct, she said. I know. I wasn't going to say that. He looked at the coffee cup. I was going to say that was the first time in about 4 years that someone came to find me because they thought my news mattered. He said it plainly, without self-pity, just a statement of fact. My father died in '72. My mother went back east the year after. The ranch has been... He stopped, started again. I've been good at the practical things. I've been less good at knowing what to do with the rest. She didn't say anything. She let it sit the way it deserved to sit, without rushing to cover it with words. I'm telling you that, he said, because I don't say things like that, and I wanted to say it before I left. In case the court goes wrong. It's not going to go wrong. You don't know that. No, she said. But I think it anyway. She looked at him. Come back, Cole. The simplicity of it seemed to surprise him. He looked at her for a moment. I'll come back, he said. He left before 8, and she sat in the lamplight for a long time after, and the fire in the small burner ticked and settled, and she thought about a man who had been alone in a practical life for 4 years and had said so without asking for anything in return, and she thought about herself and the particular wasted years and the $40 envelope and the long walk in the dust, and she thought that whatever was growing between her and Cole Mercer was growing in the right direction, and that was enough for now, and she went to bed. He came back on the 24th. He came back with the judge's ruling in his coat pocket, and it was in their favor. The Northern Water claim was found to be based on a fraudulent survey, the deed was invalidated, and the territorial court had ordered a review of the associated land records, which, as Cole had said in October, meant every other deed Crawford had filed in the territory was now subject to scrutiny. The news went through Blackstone Crossing in under 2 hours. Abigail heard it from Clara Tate, who had heard it from her father, who had apparently been waiting in front of the livery when Cole rode in and had gotten the report before the horse was stabled. She was in the middle of afternoon lessons when Clara came in slightly out of breath with the particular energy of a child delivering significant information, and Abigail held up a hand to pause the class and listened. And when Clara finished, she said, "Thank you, Clara. We'll take 5 minutes outside." And the entire class went out with the barely contained chaos of children who understand that something important has just happened, even if they don't know exactly what. She stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse and breathed. She had believed the evidence was solid. She had been resolved, not certain. There was a difference, and standing in the cold afternoon light, she felt it. The gap between what she'd been holding on to and what had just become true. Cole came to the schoolhouse that evening. He looked like a man who had slept in stages on a 4-day ride and was still going on the residue of good news, and she made coffee again, and they sat at the table and she watched him slowly come down from the sustained tension of the previous week. Crawford's attorney tried the continuance first, he said. Judge Hartley denied it. Then he tried a procedural challenge on the survey filing date. Hartley denied that too. Something close to satisfaction moved across his face. Our attorney had the original survey markers photographed before Dillard's man could interfere with them. Had 3 witnesses who'd been on that ground before Crawford filed. Crawford's deed said one thing. The ground said another. Photographs don't argue. Photographs don't argue, she agreed. Crawford's not done, he said. He'll find another angle. He's got the capital to keep trying. But he doesn't have the fraudulent survey anymore, which means he doesn't have the leverage on the northern families. No, he doesn't. Cole looked at his coffee. The Hendricks can run their cattle through spring. The Brennans have their access. It's not permanent. Crawford will regroup, but it's real, and it buys time, and sometimes time is what people need. She thought about Tom Tiller, who'd sold out when he was sick and tired, about the arithmetic of being worn down. The families need to know this changes the terms, she said, not just that they won this one, that Crawford's vulnerability is now documented in a court record. Garrett's printing it tomorrow. Good. She looked at Cole across the small table. You did this. He shook his head. The enrollment numbers didn't hurt, he said. Hartley mentioned them, actually. Said it was relevant that the community had made long-term investments. School enrollment was part of the record. She was quiet. So the children's names on a piece of paper, she said slowly, actually mattered to a court decision. They did. She sat with that for a moment. Bashwam. March moved through Blackstone Crossing with the ordinary business of a frontier spring. Mud, fencing repairs, calving season, the particular chaos of a town shaking loose from winter. The school ran. The Crawford situation moved from crisis to the slower, more permanent state of contested territory. His attorneys had filed a motion for appeal in Wichita, but it was projected to take a year to be heard. And in the meantime, the families went about their lives with the particular steadiness of people who had won a round and no more rounds are coming. Abigail and Cole fell into a pattern without formally establishing one. He came to town most Sundays. Sometimes he had a practical purpose. Supplies, the ongoing legal correspondence, a fence repair, or a building project that needed an extra set of hands. Sometimes he didn't have a particular purpose and didn't pretend to have one, which she found she respected in the particular way she respected honesty in all its forms. They rode out on the second Sunday in March, which was the first day warm enough to make it reasonable. It had been Cole's idea, stated with characteristic brevity. He had a section of fence to check on the eastern boundary, and the ride was better with company if she was willing. She was willing. She borrowed a horse from Tate, a brown mare named after a battle, Antietam, who was steady and unimpressed by the world, and they rode out into the morning with the frost still on the grass and the hills to the east going gold in the early light. He was a quiet companion, which she had expected, and a comfortable one, which she was still adjusting to. She had not had many companions in her life. Victor had required her attention, which was different, and the experience of simply riding beside someone who did not need her to perform anything was new enough to keep catching her slightly off guard. You grew up in Cincinnati, Cole said at some point, not as a question. My father was a teacher. My mother ran the household with the efficiency of a small military operation. She watched a hawk circle over the eastern slope. I was the only child. My mother had opinions about what that should mean for my prospects. Meaning she considered my size and my interests, books, teaching, not domestic management, to be problems to be solved before anyone would take a serious interest in me. She said it without particular bitterness, just as the fact it was. Victor took a serious interest. My mother was relieved. She know you're here? I wrote her in September. She wrote back in November. She said she hoped I knew what I was doing. Abigail paused. I said I was learning. Cole was quiet for a stretch. Then, my father built this ranch because he couldn't make anything work in the East. Too loud, he said. Too many people wanting things from him. He looked at the fence line coming up ahead. I understood that better as I got older. Some things are easier out here. The problems are direct. Water and land and weather, she said. Yes, and sometimes the problems are harder. He glanced at her. The solitude gets to be a habit. She thought about what he'd said before he left for Wichita. I've been less good at knowing what to do with the rest. She thought about 4 years of a practical life in a working ranch with no one to come find him when his news mattered. Habits can change, she said. Some of them, he said, and they rode on. What? She did not see it coming. That was the thing she would remember later. Not that she hadn't been warned, not that there hadn't been any signs, but that she hadn't imagined it was possible, which was its own kind of blindness. It was an ordinary Thursday in the last week of April. The morning had gone well. Nora Phelps had given an oral report on the Missouri Compromise that had held the room genuinely wrapped, including William Hendricks, who was not easily wrapped. The afternoon was reading hour, the children quiet over their books, the spring light coming through the open windows along with the smell of new grass and the distant sound of someone working iron at the far end of town. She was at the front of the room reviewing the next day's geography lesson when she heard boots on the porch. It was not the knock of a parent or a council member. It was a specific sound, heavier, more deliberate, the sound of someone not uncertain about walking in. She looked up. The door opened. She knew him before her mind had fully processed the sight, knew him from the set of the shoulders and the tilt of the jaw, and the particular way he filled a doorway as though ownership were a posture rather than a legal condition. She knew him the way you know certain sounds, not from recognition exactly, but from the body's stored record of what they have meant in the past. Victor Hale looked at her across the schoolroom full of children. He looked older. Not by much. A year and a half is not a long time, but the lines around his mouth had deepened and something in his eyes had gone harder in a way she hadn't seen before. He was well dressed, as always. His coat was clean. His boots were good. He smiled. She did not move. The children had looked up. They were watching with the attentiveness of children who have the instinct, if not the vocabulary, to recognize that an adult has just entered a room and changed its temperature. "Miss Carter," Victor said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it. The careful modulation, the control. "I've been looking for you." She set down her pencil. "Children," she said, her voice steady, steadier than she'd have predicted. "Take your books and go home. Class is dismissed for the day." They went. They moved quickly, with the cooperative speed of children responding to a tone they understood without being able to define it, filing out past Victor without looking at him directly. Clara Tate being the last out the door, pausing just briefly to look back at Abigail with something in her face that Abigail took a moment to identify as, "Do you want me to get someone?" She gave a small, brief shake of her head. Clara went. The door swung on its hinge and settled. They were alone. Victor stepped farther into the room, unhurried, and looked around at the benches and the chalkboard and the atlas on the desk with the same expression he'd used to look at her back room in Cincinnati, assessing, mild, the look of a man reviewing something that did not quite meet his standards. "Schoolteacher," he said. "I heard that. I have to admit, when I pictured you ending up out here, what do you want, Victor?" He stopped. He looked at her. The smile stayed. "To talk," he said. "That's all. I've been in Wichita for 2 months on business. I heard your name from someone who knows someone." He spread his hands. The old gesture, the one that said, "I'm reasonable, I'm open, I'm the most reasonable man in any room. I didn't handle things well on the road. I've thought about that. You left me in the middle of a territory with $14 and 2 cracked ribs. You weren't going to let me help you." She looked at him. She had spent months in this town, in this room, with these children, building something she had not known she was capable of building. She had walked into a town council and laid her credentials on a table and been believed. She had helped plan a legal strategy that ended up cited in a court decision. She had taught 18 children and watched them grow in ways that were real and visible and hers. She had ridden out on the eastern fence line with a man who had said, "I've been less good at knowing what to do with the rest," and trusted her to hear it. And Victor was standing in her classroom. "Say what you came to say," she said. His expression shifted, the smile going thinner, the charm adjusting for a different approach. "There's an opportunity in Wichita. A school. A real school. Established, funded, with a proper building and a salary that doesn't require you to live in a storage room." He let that land. "I have a connection with the board. I could facilitate an introduction. You're here to offer me a better job. I'm here because I made a mistake and I'd like to do something to correct it." "The mistake," she said, "was 2 years of my life." His expression went still. "I don't want the introduction," she said. "I don't want the Wichita school. I don't want $40 or a train ticket or any version of the arrangement where you facilitate my life from a convenient distance." She picked up her pencil. "I'd like you to leave." The stillness in his face had gone to something harder. He had always had a version of himself for when he didn't get what he wanted. She'd seen it rarely. He'd rarely wanted anything from her that required her to refuse, because he'd managed her too well for that. But she recognized it, the charm dropping, the real thing underneath. "You're being ungrateful," he said. "I'm being direct. You're making a mistake." His voice had lost its careful modulation. "You think this..." He gestured at the room, the benches, the crooked map replaced by atlas, all of it, "is real. You think these frontier people and their children are what you wanted? Yes, she said, I do. He crossed the room in 3 steps. She had miscalculated. She understood that clearly the moment he moved, the space between them collapsing faster than she'd anticipated. She got half a step back before his hand closed on her arm above the elbow, not hard enough to be unmistakable to a witness, but hard enough to be exactly what it was. You're coming back to Wichita, he said very quietly. We're going to talk about this properly, not in a classroom. Get your hand off me. Abigail, I said get your hand off me. He didn't. She had been afraid of Victor for 2 years. She had managed that fear by learning his patterns, his moods, his triggers, the geography of his temper, and how to navigate around it. She had been herself around that fear so thoroughly and for so long that she had come to mistake the bending for her actual shape. Standing in her classroom with his hand on her arm, she was aware of the fear. She would not pretend otherwise. It was there, the old trained response. And she was also aware of something else. A harder thing underneath it. Something that had been building since August, since the red dust and the $14, since the first week of school and the flour sacks and the atlas and the eastern fence line, and 18 names on a piece of paper that had been cited in a court decision. She twisted her arm free. He grabbed for her wrist. She caught the edge of the desk and put it between them. You don't live here, she said. Her voice had gone very flat. You don't know anyone here. You walked into my school and put your hand on me. And if you do it again, I will put you on the ground, and every person in this town will help me keep you there. He stared at her. She held his gaze. She did not look away. For a moment he was perfectly still, and she could see him recalculating, running through his options, assessing the room, weighing the distance to the door and the distance to her, and then the door opened behind him. Cole stood in the doorway. He had not knocked. He had simply opened the door, and he was standing in it now the way he stood in all doorways, reading the room before committing. And what he was reading was Victor's hand dropping to his side and Abigail behind the desk, and the particular quality of the air between them that required no explanation. Cole looked at Victor. He said nothing. He simply looked at him with the unhurried directness of a man who has done physical work in all weather for 20 years and is not impressed by good coats. Victor looked at Cole. Then he looked at Abigail. Something went out of his face. Not the hardness, but the calculation behind it. The arithmetic that had told him for 2 years that she was manageable. This isn't over, he said. Yes, it is, she said. Victor straightened his coat. He walked to the door. Cole stepped aside. Not far, just enough. And Victor went through, and his boots went down the porch steps. And then there was the sound of a horse being taken from the hitching post, and then hooves on the packed earth of the street, going away. Cole came inside. He looked at her arm where Victor had grabbed it. He looked at her face. Clara Tate came to the ranch, he said. She ran the whole way. Abigail looked at the door where Victor had gone, at the empty room, her room, the benches, and the atlas, and the afternoon light coming through the windows. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly. She had not noticed while it was happening. I was handling it, she said. I know, Cole said. I could see that. He did not move toward her. He did not try to touch her arm or check her wrist or stand between her and the door as though the threat might return through it. He stood in the middle of the room and let her be where she was, and the shaking in her hands slowly stopped. He'll come back, she said. Not tonight. Eventually. Maybe. Cole looked at the door. But not tonight and not easy. She breathed. She pressed her hands flat on the surface of the desk, feeling the solid wood of it. Her desk. Her room. The atlas he'd given her open to the page she'd been using for geography. The Western Territories laid out in the precise cartography of a better map than the one she'd arrived to. Thank you, she said, for coming. Clara ran the whole way, he said again, and something in his voice was not about Clara at all. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, the afternoon went on. The spring sounds of the valley, the distant hammer, the birds in the cottonwood, the ordinary turning of an ordinary Thursday. And inside the schoolroom, in the particular quiet that follows a thing passing, 2 people stood across from each other, and the distance between them felt for the first time like something that might be temporary. Victor did not come back that Thursday night, or Friday, or the weekend that followed. The town knew he'd been there. In a settlement the size of Blackstone Crossing, a stranger on a good horse asking questions about the school teacher was not something that went unnoticed. And the knowledge of his visit moved through the community in the particular way that information moves in small places, which is to say quickly and with the texture of collective opinion already forming around it. Tate mentioned, with studied casualness, that the stranger had asked him where the schoolteacher lived before he'd gone to the schoolhouse. Garrett Ellis stopped by the morning after to ask if she was all right, and to mention, also with studied casualness, that he'd written down the man's description in his reporter's notebook and the date of the visit. Martha Greer said nothing at all, but appeared at the schoolhouse door on Friday evening with a covered plate of food and the look of a woman who has decided that action is more useful than commentary. Abigail ate the food and thanked her and went back to marking. What she did not do was pretend the visit hadn't happened. She was done with that particular habit, the managed minimizing, the presentation of everything as fine, the careful curation of her own distress so that no one would be inconvenienced by it. Victor had thrived on that. She had learned the habit partly from him and partly from a lifetime of being told that her feelings were an imposition, and she was dismantling it piece by piece, which was slow work and not always graceful. She told herself clearly and without decoration what Thursday had been. A man who had controlled her for 2 years showing up to try again, and her refusing him and being shaken by it, and that being entirely reasonable. She also told herself with the same clarity that she had put the desk between them before Cole came through the door. That the desk had been her idea. Both things mattered. Cole came on Sunday with no pretense of a practical purpose. He came in the early afternoon, knocked, and when she opened the door, he said, "I thought we'd ride out to the north section. There's something I want to show you." He had 2 horses, and Tatum was there, borrowed again from Tate, which meant he'd made arrangements before he came, which meant this had been planned. She got her coat. The north section of the Mercer Ranch was higher ground, the land rising toward the ridge in a long, gradual slope that flattened out into a wide grass shelf before the true climb began. He'd mentioned the section before. It was the boundary that Crawford had tried to reach with the fraudulent survey. But she hadn't been out here, and when they crested the rise and she saw the valley laid out below, she understood why he'd brought her. It was the whole of it, the town small and distinct in the distance, the river line silver through the grass, the patchwork of fenced land and open range, the dark geometry of the Hendricks farm to the east and the Brennan place to the south and the Mercer Ranch buildings immediately below. The sky was enormous. The light was doing what spring light does on the prairie, which is to make everything look briefly possible. "This is what my father bought," Cole said. He was sitting his horse a few feet off, looking at the same view. "He rode up here the first day he had the deed, and he said, I was about 12, I remember this. He said, 'Cole, the thing about land is it doesn't lie to you.'" He paused. He meant it as something reassuring. "I think it's more complicated than that now. Land can be taken, claimed wrong, surveyed fraudulent. It lies through paperwork, if not through itself. But the ground is still the ground," she said. "The ground is still the ground." She looked at the valley. She thought about the court record in Wichita with 18 names on a school enrollment list, about the survey markers photographed before anyone could move them, about the atlas on her desk and the map replaced and the 7 errors corrected. "Victor's gone back to Wichita," she said. Tate confirmed it. "He left Friday morning." "I know." Cole looked at her. "Are you all right with that? Not just, actually all right." She thought about it. She had been thinking about it in increments since Thursday, turning it over the way you turn over something that's been lodged in a difficult place to see if it's still stuck. "I'm relieved he's gone," she said. "I'm unsettled that he came, and She paused, looking for the right word. "I'm aware that I spent 2 years being afraid of someone who was, in the end, a man with a good coat and a bad plan." Cole was quiet for a moment. "The being afraid part makes sense." "I know it makes sense. I'm not saying you shouldn't have been. I know you're not." He looked at the valley again. "I was afraid of this land for a year after my father died. Sounds strange, maybe. But I'd been helping him with it all my life, and it always had him at the center of it. And then it didn't, and everything that had been simple because he was managing it was suddenly just me." He turned the reins in his hands. "I didn't know what I was doing half the time. I was just doing the next thing because the thing after that would come regardless." She looked at him. This man who had built a ranch alone through hard winters and drought, and a fraudulent claim and 4 years of solitude, and who was now telling her about being afraid, which was not something she'd expected from him and was more valuable to her than reassurance. "The next thing," she said. "That's what I did on the road, after he left me." "I know. I just did the next thing. Walked to town, found a room, found the doctor, went to the council meeting, and made lesson plans on the stagecoach." She almost smiled. "That," Cole said, "is not a small thing. People act like practicality is lesser somehow, less than feeling your way through. But it takes something to do the next thing when the next thing is all you've got." She looked at him for a moment. "You're surprisingly good at this," she said. He frowned slightly. "At what?" "Saying things that are actually true rather than things that are meant to be comforting." He considered that. "I'm not always sure there's a difference." "There is. Comfort says it'll be fine. Truth says you did the next thing and you're here." She looked back at the valley. "The second one is better." They sat for a while in the particular quiet of two people who have run out of immediate things to say but have not run out of each other's company, and the light shifted on the grass below, and Antietam put her nose down to investigate something in the scrub, and Blackstone Crossing sat in the distance, going about its ordinary afternoon. "My mother wants me to come back east," Cole said eventually, not as a statement of intent but as a thing he was putting on the table. "She writes once a year, always mentions it." "What do you tell her?" "That the ranch needs me." "Is that the real reason?" He was quiet for a beat longer than usual. "The real reason is that I built something here and I don't know who I'd be somewhere that doesn't have it in it." He looked at the valley. "That probably sounds like someone who knows what he's built," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face had gone open in a way she'd only seen in pieces before. In the lamplight before he left for Wichita, in the schoolroom doorway on Thursday. And she understood that Cole Mercer's openness was not something he distributed widely. It came in specific moments, at specific costs, and it was real every time. "Yes," he said. "I suppose that's it." Yeah. May came, and with it the particular business of late spring, calving season at the Mercer Ranch, planting season for the farming families, the school running through its final weeks before the summer break. Abigail had begun planning the fall curriculum with the particular intensity she brought to all forward planning, which had the additional benefit of forcing her attention toward September rather than back at April. Victor had not reappeared. She was cautious about this. Absence was not the same as resolution, she knew that. But the weeks of ordinary days were doing their quiet work, and the particular vigilance she'd been carrying since Thursday gradually softened into something more sustainable. She spent more time at the ranch. This happened by increments, the way most things happen between her and Cole, a gradual accumulation of occasions rather than a single decision. He had asked her, the Sunday after the North Section ride, if she'd like to see the calving operation, which was interesting to about half the people in agricultural detail to the other half, but she was genuinely curious and said yes. She came out the following Tuesday after school and found Cole and Daniel Hendricks, who was working for Cole that season, managing a difficult birth with the focused practicality of men who've done it before. And she held a lamp and handed implements when asked, and was not squeamish, which Cole noticed with the small approving look he gave to competence in unexpected places. After that, it was easier. She came on Sundays sometimes, and occasionally on a weekday evening when the school day had been long and the storeroom felt particularly small, and she wanted the open space of the ride. She helped with things when help was needed. Bookkeeping one Saturday afternoon, when Cole's records had gotten behind during the legal proceedings, and the columns needed straightening, which she was good at. A fence repair on the south side that needed 3 hands rather than 2. She was aware that the town had opinions about this, and she was aware with something like liberation that she did not particularly care what they were. She had given years of her life to the management of other people's impressions. She was 32 years old, and she'd walked 2 miles in the heat dragging a trunk, and she had cracked ribs and $14, and a teaching certificate, and she had built something out of those materials. And if people wanted to form opinions about her spending time at the Mercer Ranch, she was content to let them. Martha, for what it was worth, offered no opinions. She did, however, increase the dinner portions again. It was a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week of May when Victor Hale came back. She knew the moment she opened the schoolhouse door to go home and found him on the porch step. He had not knocked. He had simply been there, waiting, with a quality of patience that was not peace but something else. The patience of a man who has recalculated his approach and is confident in the revision. He looked different from April. The good coat was the same, but something in his bearing had shifted. He had the look of a man who had spent 3 weeks deciding something and arrived at his decision. "I'd like to talk," he said. "We talked in April." "I handled that poorly." He held up both hands, the gesture that meant, "I'm reasonable." "I know I did. I'm not here to argue." He looked at her steadily. "I need you to hear me out. That's all I'm asking." She stood in the doorway. She could close the door. She could go get Cole or Martha or Garrett or any number of people. She could simply walk away. She stayed where she was because she had learned, in the months since August, in the months of teaching 18 children and running legal correspondence and sitting on the north section looking at the valley, that the thing she wanted was not to avoid Victor, but to be done with him. And those were different things. Avoidance left the door open. Done was done. "Say what you came to say," she said. He came in. He looked around the room the way he had in April. The benches, the atlas, the chalkboard with tomorrow's lesson written on it. But something was different in his looking. April had been dismissal. This was closer to recognition, the slight shift of a man confronting evidence that doesn't fit his prior assessment. "You've built something here," he said. She didn't respond. "I mean that straightforwardly." He turned to face her. "I didn't think you would. I want to be honest about that. I thought you'd struggle for a few months and come back to Cincinnati." He stopped, started again. "I was wrong." "Yes," she said. "I'd like to be—" He searched for the word, "different, going forward. I know what I did to you, Abigail, not just on the road, before that, the 2 years. I know what I was." She looked at him. This was the thing she had not been prepared for. Not the anger, not the grabbing, not the good coat and the controlling patience. This, the version of Victor that could say, "I know what I was," in a voice that sounded like he meant it. She had seen this version before, twice in 2 years, in difficult moments, and each time she had bent toward it like a plant toward light, because it was what she'd wanted. Just some acknowledgement, some evidence that she hadn't imagined the whole thing, that there was a person in there who understood what he'd done. "I know you know what you were," she said. "Knowing doesn't fix it. It's a start. Victor." She said his name with a deliberateness that was not anger and not grief, but something more final than both. "I believe you. I believe you know what you were. I believe this version of you that's standing here right now is real. I have seen it before, and it was real those times too." She held his gaze. And then it ended. It always ended. Because the knowing was something you could feel about yourself, not something you did anything with. He was very still. "I don't want to hear about what you know," she said. "I want to go home. Home is a storage room in a schoolhouse." "Yes," she said, "it is, and I built what's in it." He stood there for a moment, the stillness of a man absorbing something that doesn't resolve into a usable response. She watched him work through it, the charm, the reasonable man posture, the "I know what I was" that had been his best card and had not played the way he'd expected. Then his face changed. She saw it, the thing that lived under the recalculations, the real architecture of Victor Hale. Not malice, exactly, not even cruelty in the simple sense, something more specific and more stubborn, the deep, intractable inability to accept that he had not gotten what he had come for. "You think that rancher is something better," he said. His voice had gone very flat. "I think most people are something better," she said. "That's not why I'm not going back with you." "Then why?" "Because I'm not going back with you." She moved to the door and opened it. "Goodbye, Victor." He did not move. She held the door. He looked at her for a long moment, the door and the April evening outside and her standing in the frame, and she saw him arrive at something, some final accounting, and she braced for whatever came next. What came next was not words. He crossed the room fast. She didn't have time for the desk this time. He was between her and it, his hand closing on her arm, the same way it had in April, but harder now, the management damage gone out of him, and he said something low and furious that she caught only in pieces, And she did what she had not done in April, because in April she'd still been finding her footing. She hit him, not a slap. She drove the heel of her hand hard into his sternum, the way Tate's wife had casually demonstrated once while discussing frontier practicalities. And it was enough to break his grip and send him back a step. And she used that step to get herself to the door and through it and onto the porch. "Get out of my school," she said. He came through the door after her. She was already calling, not screaming, calling, with the full voice projection she'd developed over a year of managing a room full of children. Cole! It was not, in the honest accounting, because she couldn't manage without him. It was because she was not going to manage this alone when she didn't have to, and because she had finally, over the course of the previous 9 months, learned the difference between needing no one and choosing who to need. Victor came off the porch and grabbed her wrist. She twisted, got her arm free, put the porch railing between them. Cole was coming down the street at a run. He hadn't been in the schoolhouse this time. He'd been at Tate's livery, 60 yards up the street, and he was covering that distance with the particular economy of movement of a man who is not wasting any of it on anything that isn't the destination. He came through the schoolyard gate and onto the path, and Victor turned to face him. "This is between me and Abigail," Victor said. Cole didn't break stride. "Victor," she said, and her voice was steady, "I've asked you to leave my school twice. Cole?" He grabbed my wrist. Cole stopped 3 feet from Victor. He looked at Victor's hand, the one that had been on her wrist, and then at Victor's face, and the look was not rage, which would have been simpler, but something colder and more considered, the look of a man who has done the arithmetic and arrived at a number. "You need to leave this town," Cole said. It was not loud. It was not theatrical. It was information delivered with the same directness he applied to everything. Victor drew himself up. "I don't take instruction from—" "Tonight," Cole said. "Not tomorrow, tonight." Something in his voice reached Victor in a way that his words had not. Not fear, exactly. Victor was not easily frightened, but the recognition of a man who was not going to negotiate. Victor looked at Abigail. She met his eyes. The last of whatever she'd been carrying, the 2 years, the arranged worth, the $40, the managed life. She felt it go out of her like a breath she'd been holding so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to hold it. Not with feeling better, not with something resolved and clean. Just gone. The way weight goes when you set it down. "We're done," she said to Victor. "We have been since August." He stood there for one more moment. Then he straightened his coat. He walked past Cole without looking at him. He went through the gate and down the street, and the sound of his boots went away and did not come back. Cole turned to her. "Your wrist," he said. "It's fine." He looked at it anyway. She let him. He held it briefly, checking, the way he'd once checked the joint in a fence post, assessing, practical, not making anything of the contact beyond what it was. "He's not coming back this time," Cole said. "How do you know?" "Because he's run out of approaches." He looked toward the street where Victor had gone. Men like that, they have strategies. When the strategies stop working, they move on to somewhere the strategies haven't been tried yet. She thought about the tillers, about the man who built a grid and ran his clock, about the patience of systematic pressure. "He's not Crawford," she said. "He doesn't have the capital for patience." "No, he doesn't." She looked at the schoolhouse, her school, her room, the storeroom window. She looked out at the schoolyard every morning, the cottonwood tree that had put out new leaves in April and was now full and green in the May evening, the atlas on the desk visible through the open door. "Thank you," she said, "for running." "You were calling," he said simply. She looked at him. This man who ran when she called, without reservation, without the need to be the only solution, who had stood in her doorway in April and said, "I could see that," when she told him she'd been handling it. Who had said, "I've been less good at knowing what to do with the rest," and trusted her with it. "Cole?" "Yes." "I'm going to stay in Blackstone Crossing," she said. "Not because I don't have options. Wichita exists. Cincinnati exists. There are other schools." She looked at him steadily. "I'm staying because this is where I've built something, and because the people here are worth staying for." She paused. "I wanted to say that plainly." He was quiet for a moment. "All the people?" he said. Careful, direct. "Some more than others," she said. The evening was going long and gold around them, The prairie light doing what it does in May, generous, unhurried, and the schoolyard smelled of new grass and the cottonwood's particular fresh green, and Cole Mercer stood in front of her with the last of the day's light on his face and something in his expression that she had never seen there before, which was simply open. "I've been trying to find the right way to say something for about 4 months," he said. "Then just say it." "I don't want you to go," he said. "I don't mean the town. I don't want you to go." He said it the second time with a different weight, the clarification that was really the whole statement. "That's not... I know you've just come through something, and I'm not... Cole. I'm not asking you for anything right now. I'm just saying the true thing." "I know." She looked at him. "I'm not going." He breathed. Not a dramatic release, just a breath. The small adjustment of a man who has been carrying something and has just set it down. She recognized it because she'd just done something similar. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They stood in the May evening while the light finished going, and the town around them went about its ordinary business, and neither of them moved toward the other because they were not in a hurry, and that itself was something. The particular confidence of people who have decided they have time. Summer opened the valley up and spread it out, the grass going long and gold in June, the sky that particular deep prairie blue that goes on forever at the edges. The school was closed for summer, and Abigail used the time the way she always used time, purposefully. She drafted the fall curriculum with the additional sections for the new enrollment. She wrote to the Cincinnati Normal School for updated texts and received, along with the books, a letter from a former colleague asking about teaching conditions on the frontier, which she answered at length. She helped Martha with the quarterly accounts. She read Nora Phelps' summer reading. Nora had asked for a list, and Abigail had provided one, and now they were corresponding about it in written notes passed at the general store, which was perhaps more formal than necessary but suited them both. She went to the ranch often. She was there the Thursday afternoon in June when Cole's horse came up lame on the south pasture, and she and Daniel Hendricks got it back to the stable, and she held the lamp while Cole checked the leg with the same focused attention he gave to everything. And afterward they sat on the porch steps in the warm evening, eating bread and cold meat, and not talking much. And she was struck by the particular quality of the quiet, not the quiet of avoidance or careful management, but the quiet of two people who don't need to fill space. She was there on a Sunday in July when a storm came in fast from the northwest, the kind that the prairie produces without much warning, and they were caught on the ride back from checking the north fence, and took shelter in the old line shack at the edge of the property while the rain came down in sheets against the roof. They sat on the floor with their backs to the wall and the lamp between them and talked for 3 hours. About his father, about her years in Cincinnati, about what Nora Phelps was going to be when she was grown, about Crawford's appeal still grinding through the Wichita court, about the atlas and what the 7 errors on the old map had actually been. And when the rain stopped and the moon came out and they rode back, she thought that she had not talked that honestly with anyone in years, possibly ever. She was there on a late August evening when the school was 2 weeks from reopening and the valley was at its most generous, the summer just beginning to tip toward something cooler, the light going amber and easy in the evenings. They were sitting on the ranch porch, coffee, the valley below them going from gold to purple in the late hour, and Cole said, with the particular care he put into direct statements, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that the answer doesn't change anything. You don't have to ask it," she said. He looked at the valley. "I've been thinking about next year," he said, "and the year after, and the..." He stopped. Tried again. "When I ride this land, I think about it differently than I did before you came. I think about who it's for, not just what it is, and I think about..." His voice went level in the way that meant something cost him. "I think about you not being in it." She said nothing. She let him finish. "I'm not saying it right," he said. "You're saying it fine. I'm asking if you'd consider..." He looked at her. "Building this with me. Not immediately. Not before you're ready. But eventually." She looked at the valley. The last of the light was leaving the hills to the west, and the valley floor was going dark, and the lights of Blackstone Crossing were coming on one by one in the distance, small and specific and real. She thought about the woman who had arrived here 13 months ago, face down in the red dust, with $14 and cracked ribs and a battered trunk. She thought about what that woman would have done with a question like this, The management of it, the performance of gratitude, the careful minimizing of her own wants to make sure she didn't take up too much space. She thought about what this woman, the one sitting on this porch, the one who had put her hand on a man's chest and driven him back and called for help without shame, and stayed in a town because she had built something and it was worth staying for. She thought about what this woman wanted. Not eventually, she said. Not immediately. She looked at him. But soon. Cole looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not the almost smile, was not the careful containment, was not any of the versions of Cole Mercer she'd assembled over 13 months. It was something more unguarded than all of them, and it was real, and she was not afraid of it. Soon, he said. Soon, she agreed. The valley went on below them, dark and immense and indifferent in the way that land is indifferent. Not hostile, just permanent. And in the face of all that permanence, two people sat on a porch and decided to be impermanent together, which is the most stubborn thing a person can decide to do. And they stayed until the stars came out over the western ridge, and the night settled over Blackstone Crossing, and the cottonwood in the schoolyard across town moved in a wind that smelled of the coming fall. Soon turned out to mean November. Not because they had decided on November specifically, but because November was when everything that needed to settle had settled, and the two of them had spent enough time in each other's company. Enough Sunday afternoons and Tuesday evenings and storm-caught hours in a line shack and ordinary working days that blurred at the edges into something more than practical. That the question Cole had asked on the August porch had stopped being a question and started being a direction they were already moving in. The fall term opened with 22 students, which required a second row of new benches and a reorganization of the classroom that Abigail worked out on paper 3 times before it satisfied her. William Hendricks, now 12 and operating at the confident edge of his abilities, had taken on the unofficial role of assistant for the younger children's reading. Not assigned, simply assumed, the way competent people assume roles when they see the need. And Abigail let him do it because it was good for him and good for the room, and because she'd learned that the best teaching sometimes meant getting out of the way of what was already working. Nora Phelps had stopped crossing her arms. It had happened gradually over the summer, through the written notes about books and the return of school in September, and the particular confidence that comes from being consistently treated as someone whose thoughts are worth reading. Nora was 13 now, and she still sat in the back row, and she still wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but when she spoke, the room listened, and she had begun to understand that about herself. Abigail watched this with the particular satisfaction of a person who has cultivated something and watched it grow in a direction she hoped for but couldn't guarantee. This was the work, not the curriculum plans or the enrollment numbers or the legal correspondence, though all of those had mattered. The work was this: a girl who had arrived with her arms crossed and her mother recently dead, learning that her own mind was worth something. A boy who couldn't do his sums, finding out he could. A valley of families deciding to stay because the town had a future and the future had a school in it. Abigail thought about this on her morning walks from the schoolhouse to Martha's store, where she still took most of her meals. She thought about what her mother in Cincinnati would make of it. The storeroom, the 22 students, the atlas on the desk, the ranch 4 miles out where she spent her Sundays. Her mother's last letter in July had asked whether she was certain the frontier was what she wanted, and whether she'd considered that the opportunities available to a woman of her background were perhaps better pursued in a more established setting. She had written back, "I'm certain. The setting is establishing itself." She did not know if her mother understood that. She suspected her mother understood more than she let on, which had always been true, and that the letters would continue in their careful, indirect way, and that someday, not soon, but someday, she would bring her mother west to see what she'd built, and her mother would look at it with the specific expression of a woman revising an assessment she'd made long ago, and neither of them would say much about it, and it would be enough. The Crawford appeal was decided in October. The Wichita court upheld the original ruling. The territorial review that had been ordered in February had turned up 2 additional fraudulent surveys filed under Crawford's name in the county records. Not large discrepancies, not the kind that announced themselves, the kind that accumulated quietly over years until a man controlled more than the paperwork strictly showed. Both surveys were invalidated. One of them affected a claim Crawford had been using to pressure a ranching family 30 miles to the north who had not known they had grounds to contest it. Garrett Ellis ran the story on the front page, which was the first time he'd put anything on the front page that wasn't weather or harvest prices in 2 years. Crawford did not contest the second ruling. He did not leave the territory. A man with his capital and his patience does not leave. He recalculates. But the recalculation, for the time being, moved his operations to the eastern counties, away from the valley, away from the families who had held on through 2 years of systematic pressure and a court battle and the grinding arithmetic of a man with more resources than any of them. The Hendricks family ran their cattle through to winter without interruption. The Brennans expanded their south pasture. 2 families that had been considering leaving sent their children back to school in the fall. Cole received the news in a letter from the Wichita attorney on a Thursday afternoon, and he rode into town and came directly to the schoolhouse, arriving at the door just as Abigail was sending the children home. He stood on the porch while the last of them filed out and handed her the letter, and she read it on the step in the October light. She read it twice. She handed it back. "It's done," she said. "For now." "For now," she agreed. She thought about Crawford's systematic patience, the grid of leverage, the roads and the mill and the water rights. And she knew Cole was right, that for now was the honest framing. A man like Crawford didn't stop, he redirected. But redirection was real. The valley had bought itself time, and time was what people needed. And the families had used the time to plant and fence and send their children to school and build things that would take more than one bad actor to undo. "The Millers got their north pasture back," Cole said. "The family up toward Dodge who didn't know they had a claim. I saw. They've got 3 kids, school age." She looked at him. "That's 30 miles away," she said. "There's no school there." "Cole." "I'm not suggesting anything," he said. "I'm just noting it." She looked at the letter in his hand. She thought about the note she'd written to the Cincinnati Normal School in the summer, and the response she'd gotten, and the idea that had been sitting in the back of her mind since then like a seed waiting for a reasonable moment to become something more than an idea. "I've been writing to the Territorial Education Office," she said. "Since July." Quietly. He looked at her. "There's a provision in the territorial charter for satellite schoolhouses," she said. "Smaller ones, 1 teacher serving a radius. The county contributes to the building cost if a community petitions." She folded her hands. "I wasn't going to mention it until I knew whether the appeal went our way. Because if Crawford had won, the families in this valley wouldn't have had the stability to petition for anything. But now," she looked at the letter, "now they might." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "You've been planning this since July." "I've been thinking about it since July." There's a difference. Something moved in his face. The thing she'd learned to identify as Cole recognizing something about her that he hadn't quite seen before, which happened with a frequency that she found alternately gratifying and faintly amusing. She was not a simple person. She was aware of this. It was not the convenient kind of depth that reveals itself all at once. "You're going to want to go to the territory's office in person," he said. "Probably." "Wichita." "Probably Wichita." He nodded with the air of a man updating his plans. "I can take you in the spring. I'll have business with the attorney anyway for the final filings." She looked at him. "All right," she said. Done. It was Martha Greer who first used the word wedding. She used it on a Wednesday evening in early November, with the same directness she applied to inventory. "If you and Cole are going to do this before winter, you'll want to do it before the deep freeze sets in. Ground still workable for 3 weeks, maybe 4. Abigail, who had been helping Martha update the store's winter supply list, looked up. "I didn't say we were doing anything before winter." "You didn't need to." Martha made a notation in her ledger. "He came in Monday and asked me what you'd want for a ring, not what's available, what you'd want." Abigail set down her pencil. "What did you tell him?" she said. "I told him you'd want something that wasn't fussy." Martha turned a page. "Simple, well made, nothing that gets in the way when you're working." He nodded like he already knew that and was just checking. She sat with this for a moment. "Martha," she said. Did you—" She stopped, tried again. "Do you think I'm—" "Yes," Martha said, before she'd finished the question. Abigail looked at her. "I've watched you for 14 months, Martha said, without looking up from the ledger. I watched you drag a trunk across 2 miles of open ground with cracked ribs. I watched you walk into a room full of skeptical men and lay your lesson plans on the table. I watched you tell Victor Hale, twice, to leave your school. And I've watched you with Cole. She turned another page. You're not making a mistake. You're making a decision, which is different, and you've been making it for a long time. Abigail thought about Victor and the years before, and the careful managed life of a woman who had spent so long minimizing herself that she'd nearly disappeared inside it. She thought about the road from the stage accident to this room, this town, this life. I was not easy to know, she said. When I first came here, Martha finally looked up. You were exactly as easy to know as a person is when they've been told for years that knowing them is inconvenient. She held Abigail's gaze. That's not a character flaw. That's damage. There's a difference. Abigail was quiet. Damage repairs, Martha said, and went back to her ledger. Cole asked her on a Saturday evening in the second week of November. Not in the schoolhouse, not on the ranch porch, not in any of the places where they'd had the significant conversations. He asked her in the most ordinary possible location, which was the general store after closing, where she'd come to return a borrowed lamp and found him there waiting because apparently he had arranged this too. The way he arranged most things, quietly, with preparation, without making a performance of it. He had the ring in his coat pocket. It was simple and well made, a gold band with a single small stone that was not ostentatious and not an afterthought. She would find out later that he'd ordered it from a craftsman in Dodge City 3 months before, which was July, which was the same month she'd started writing to the Territorial Education Office and had not told him because she was waiting to see how things resolved. They had both apparently been making plans in the same direction without coordinating them. He did not kneel dramatically. He was not theatrical by nature, and she did not want theater. He stood in the lamplight of Martha Greer's closed general store, between the flour sacks and the dry goods, and the particular smell of a frontier general store, which is pine and coffee and something earthy and real. And he held out the ring and said, I want to build the rest of this with you, if you'll let me. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about the word let. Not if you're willing, or if you'd consider, but if you'll let me, as though the thing he was asking for was permission to be part of something she'd already built, as though he understood that the building had been hers first and was not asking to take it over, but to add to it. She thought about the woman in the August dust who had put the $40 envelope back on Victor's trunk. She thought about 14 months of next things and what they'd accumulated into. Yes, she said. He put the ring on her finger. It fit, because of course it did. He had paid attention. He always paid attention. And then he took her hand in both of his and held it for a moment in the lamplight, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. They married on the 22nd of December, which was the Saturday before Christmas. The town turned out, which Abigail had not expected and which moved her in ways she was not entirely prepared for. She had planned a small ceremony, herself and Cole and Martha and Garrett as witnesses, Tate and his wife because they'd been kind from the beginning, the Hendricks family because Cole had wanted them there. What she got was most of Blackstone Crossing standing in the cold outside the town hall because the inside couldn't hold them all. The children came. Clara Tate, with her braids neat and her dress that finally fit, stood with her father and beamed with the complete unself-consciousness of a child who is witnessing something she considers entirely right. The Hendricks brothers stood in a row in their good shirts, William having apparently attempted to comb his hair into submission and achieved partial results. Nora Phelps stood at the back with her arms at her sides, not crossed. And when Abigail caught her eye across the crowd, Nora gave her a small private nod that contained more than ceremony. The ceremony itself was performed by a justice of the peace named Aldridge, who had ridden in from the next county and who conducted the proceeding with the efficient dignity of a man who had done it many times and understood that the meaning was in the people, not the words. Cole stood beside her in his good coat, the same quality of coat he always wore, not fancier, just clean and well kept. And when they were asked to speak their intentions, he looked at her with that unguarded expression she'd first seen on the August porch and said his words clearly and without hesitation, and she said hers the same way. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried easily, and she was not going to start at her own wedding, But there was a moment between the words and the ring being settled finally into its permanent place and the sound of Blackstone Crossing coming up in the cold around her, when she felt the whole weight of the 14 months, compressed into something dense and real, and she held it for a moment before it distributed itself into the ordinary fabric of going forward. Martha Greer, standing to her left, produced a handkerchief from her coat pocket at that exact moment without looking at her, and held it out sideways, and Abigail took it, and did not use it, and held it anyway, and that was the most she and Martha would ever say about it directly. After there was food in the general store, Martha had organized this with military efficiency and multiple co-conspirators, and the town crowded in out of the cold and the noise was considerable, and the children ran between legs and got underfoot and were not corrected. Garrett Ellis ate 3 pieces of pie and then wrote a piece for the paper about the wedding, which he showed to Abigail a week later, and which she read twice and then kept in the atlas on her desk between the pages showing the Western Territories. At some point in the late afternoon, when the celebration had wound down to the last dozen people sitting with coffee and the children asleep in corners, Cole found her sitting on the counter in the back of the store. Not elegant, not appropriate, but the counter was available and her feet had been carrying her since before dawn. He sat beside her, which was not elegant either, and they sat on Martha Greer's store counter while the December light went thin and blue outside the windows, and the last of their wedding day went quietly into the past.
"Are you all right?" he said. "I'm very tired and very happy," she said. Those are both true simultaneously. "Good." He looked at the room, the last guests, the cleared plates, the pine boughs Martha had hung for Christmas. "It was a good day." "It was a good day," she agreed.
It was, in fact, not a perfect day. The pie had been slightly overbaked. Aldridge had mispronounced Cole's surname once and corrected himself awkwardly. 2 of the Hendricks boys had gotten into a shoving match in the back corner over something related to a piece of cake, and Daniel had broken it up with the weary authority of an oldest sibling. Abigail's feet genuinely hurt. Cole had been so focused during the ceremony on saying things correctly that he'd held his breath between sentences in a way she'd noticed and found, somehow, more touching than any polished delivery would have been. It was not perfect. It was real, which was better. The years that followed arranged themselves the way years do when people are genuinely occupied, quickly in retrospect, fully in the living of them. The Territorial Education Office approved the petition for a satellite schoolhouse in the spring, and a second school was established 28 miles north, serving the families in that radius, including the Millers and 4 other homesteading families who had been making do without formal education for their children. A young woman from Kansas City came out to teach it, and Abigail spent 3 weeks in the fall of that first year going over curriculum and classroom management with her, in the particular way she'd have wanted someone to do for her when she'd arrived in Blackstone Crossing a year and a half before. She did not give advice like a senior authority. She gave it like someone who had made every mistake in the same classroom and knew which ones mattered and which ones were just learning. The Mercer Ranch grew by 200 acres in the second year. Land purchased honestly, surveyed properly, documented in triplicate by a man who had learned from Crawford's methods what documentation was actually for. Cole hired 2 hands, and Daniel Hendricks became a permanent fixture, the work having suited him and the proximity to his family being something he valued more than he'd have admitted at 17. They had a son in the 3rd year. They named him James, which was Cole's father's name. He was born in February, which is the worst possible month on the prairie, in a difficult labor that lasted 18 hours and frightened Cole in a way he'd never been frightened before, quietly and completely. And when it was over and Abigail was exhausted and sore and holding the baby in the gray morning light, she looked at Cole sitting in the chair beside the bed, with his elbows on his knees and his face doing the thing it did when he was containing something, and she said, "Come here." He sat on the edge of the bed. She put the baby in his arms. He held James with the same attention he gave to everything that mattered, careful, complete, entirely present, and looked at him for a long moment. "He looks like you," Cole said. "He looks like himself," Abigail said. "He'll look like himself for the rest of his life. Let's not start making him look like other people already." Cole smiled. Not the almost smile. The real one. The one she'd first heard as a laugh in October of the first year and had been collecting versions of ever since. "All right," he said. They had a daughter 3 years after James. Her name was Ruth, which was Abigail's grandmother's name, and she was born in May,
which is the best possible month on the prairie, and she came into the world at a great deal more speed and with considerably less drama than her brother, which turned out to be characteristic.
Crawford settled the appeal in the 5th year, not a victory, not a capitulation either. A negotiated resolution in which Crawford retained some holdings in the eastern county, acknowledged the fraudulent surveys on record, and paid restitution to the families whose claims had been affected. The Millers received 2 years of lost grazing income. The Hendricks family received compensation for the legal costs of the original proceeding. It was not justice in the clean, satisfying sense. Crawford remained a wealthy man with land and capital and the patience of someone who had learned to operate at a lower profile. But the court record stood. The documentation stood. The community he had spent years trying to dismantle had outlasted his strategy, and that was a real thing, even if it wasn't the sweeping vindication that stories sometimes promise. Garrett Ellis ran the story. Abigail read it at the kitchen table in the ranch house. She'd moved to the ranch after the wedding, the storeroom given over to a storage function. It was actually suited for. And she read it twice and then set it down and thought about the woman who had walked into town 14 months before, believing that $14 in cracked ribs and a set of lesson plans were insufficient. She thought about the things that had turned out to matter: the enrollment numbers, the documentation, the community that showed up for its own school in December cold. None of it had been sufficient on its own. All of it had been sufficient together. This was the thing she turned over most. In the years of teaching and the years of watching the valley and the years of building a life with a man who said true things rather than comforting ones. The sufficiency of together. Not a romantic idea. She was too practical for romantic ideas in their pure form, but a structural one. The way a community like a building holds its load not through any single element, but through the distribution of weight across everything connected. She had come here alone. She had stayed because of what she'd built here, and the building had always been collective. The families, the children, Martha and Garrett and Tate, Cole and the valley, and the ranch and the north section with its view of everything. The solitude she'd feared on the August porch in that first year, the one that had felt like an accusation. You don't belong anywhere. You never have. Had turned out to be not a condition, but a period. A season that things can grow through if a person stays long enough and does the next thing when the next thing is all they have. The school ran its 10th term in the autumn of the 10th year, and by then it had 51 students and 2 teachers, Abigail still teaching the older children, a second teacher named Mrs. Foyle handling the younger grades, and there were plans for a second room to be added to the building in the spring. Nora Phelps had gone east to study. She had left 2 years before, at 17, with a letter of recommendation from Abigail to the Kansas City Normal School that had taken Abigail an entire Sunday afternoon to write. Not because she lacked things to say, but because there were too many. Nora had read the letter before she left. Abigail had given it to her unsealed, deliberately, because she wanted her to know what was in it. And Nora had folded it carefully and put it in her bag and said, in her direct, considered way, "I wouldn't be going if you hadn't come." Abigail had said, "You'd have gone. Might have taken longer." Nora had looked at her. "Maybe," she'd said, "but you showed me what it looked like to walk into a room you weren't sure you belonged in and stay anyway." This was the thing that stayed with Abigail long after Nora's stage had left and the dust had settled on the road. Not as a compliment, she was too practical for pure compliments, but as a description of something true. Walking into rooms you weren't sure you belonged in and staying anyway. That was the whole of it, really. Not courage in the dramatic sense. Not certainty. Just the refusal to let uncertainty be the deciding factor. She had walked into Blackstone Crossing with nothing but the determination to do the next thing, and the next thing had led here. The school, the ranch, the children, the valley, the man who held their son in February light and said he looks like you and accepted the correction without deflation. She thought about what she would say to the woman in the red dust, if she could. Not comfort. That woman had not needed comfort. She'd needed a direction. She would say, "Keep walking. The town is 2 miles east. You'll need a room and a doctor, and you'll drag that trunk farther than your ribs want you to. And the storeroom is small, and the winters are hard, and none of it is what you pictured. But you're going to build a school, and the school is going to change things, and the things it changes will change other things, and none of them will be perfect, and all of them will be real. Keep walking. James turned 7 in the fall of the 10th year, and he was a serious child who had inherited his father's habit of reading a room before entering it, and his mother's habit of asking questions that required more than a one-sentence answer. He had been in school for 2 years and had already exceeded the level of most children a year older, which Abigail was careful not to make too much of in public because she'd learned early that teachers' children had a complicated road in their parents' classroom. She made him work for everything. He seemed to understand this was the deal and accept it with equanimity. Ruth was 4 and entirely different. A girl who entered every room as though she'd built it herself, whose laugh was audible across a working ranch, and who had once dismantled a fence gate with such methodical efficiency that Cole had stood watching for 3 minutes before stopping her, trying to determine how she'd figured it out. They were not easy children. They were real ones. They argued with each other about things that did not matter and needed managing about things that did. And James went quiet when he was upset in the way his father did, and Ruth made her displeasure extremely legible. And Abigail loved them in the particular daily way of a person who has chosen to love specific, complicated, inconvenient people, which is the only real kind. On a Sunday evening in October of the 10th year, when James and Ruth were in bed and the house was the particular quiet of a settled house. At the end of a settled day, Abigail sat at the kitchen table with a stack of student papers, and Cole sat across from her with the ranch accounts, and the lamp was between them. And outside the window, the October night was cold and clear, and the stars over the western ridge were extraordinary. This was ordinary. This was Tuesday and Sunday and every day in between. It was not the ordinary of resignation, the managed, diminished ordinary of a life made small to fit what other people said was reasonable. It was the ordinary of sufficiency, of a life that had been built piece by piece from $14 and cracked ribs and a teaching certificate and a decision made in the red dust of an August road, not to take the $40. Cole looked up from the accounts. She looked up from the papers. Neither of them said anything. This was what she had not known, arriving here, that she had been missing. Not the grand declarations or the dramatic gestures. Not the romantic certainty she'd been told was what love looked like. Those things existed, and she'd had them, in their way. The lamplight conversations, and the North Section view, and the December wedding, and the February morning when he'd sat on the edge of the bed and held their son. But the center of it was this: a kitchen table, a lamp between two people, the ordinary evening of a life that they had decided, together and imperfectly and with full knowledge of its difficulty, was worth building. She went back to her papers. He went back to his accounts. Outside, Blackstone Crossing was doing what small towns do at the end of an ordinary day. Settling, quieting, the lights going out one by one as people went to bed to get up and do the next thing in the morning, because that is what living in a place means. Not arrival, not the dramatic moment of claiming, but the sustained daily decision to stay and work and be part of something that extends beyond yourself in directions you can't entirely predict. Abigail Carter had arrived in this valley as a woman that most people had looked past, a woman whose worth had been calculated by others using measurements she hadn't chosen and found consistently wanting. She had been left in the dust and told, in effect, that she was a problem best managed at a distance. She had built a school instead. Not because building schools was the answer to being overlooked. It wasn't, not universally, not as a prescription. But because it was her specific answer to her specific situation, arrived at by doing the next thing, when the next thing was all she had. Some people's answer is different. Some people's valley is a different shape. The direction matters less than the decision to keep walking toward it. She had learned over 10 years that worth is not conferred. It is not given by the right person finally seeing you, or by a town finally accepting you, or by a court ruling finally going your way. Those things matter. They are real, and they have weight, and they change what is possible. But they are not the source. The source is what you do with the next thing in front of you when you have nothing else to navigate by. She had done that. Not perfectly. She had been afraid when fear was inconvenient, wrong when she'd been certain, slow to trust when trust would have served her. She had brought damage with her and repaired it gradually, and some of the repairs still showed and probably always would. She was 39 years old. She had 2 children asleep in the rooms above her head. She had 51 students and a second schoolroom going up in the spring, and a letter from Nora Phelps that had arrived last month from Kansas City, full of questions about curriculum that told her the answer before it was asked. She had a man across the table from her who had said, "If you'll let me," and had meant it every day since. She had a valley that had held. She looked up from the student papers one more time and looked at the window, at the October stars over the western ridge, at the dark shape of the cottonwood in the schoolyard visible even at this distance, and she felt, not triumph, not the clean resolution of a difficulty overcome, but something quieter and more durable. She felt like a woman who had walked the 2 miles, who had kept walking, who was finally, and without apology, exactly where she had come to be.